Logic gives you everything you need to create a professional mix and master, but the secret isn't in Logic, it's in how you use it. So in today's video, we're going to go through everything you need to know to create a professional sounding mix and master inside Logic. But before we get into any of it, let's fast forward and listen to the before and after the song that we'll be mixing throughout the series so that you know if I'm someone you want to learn from.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the figure. Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud, we're all getting sick of it, yeah.
Okay, so if that sounds good to you and you want to learn from me, then stick around. We're going to go through everything you need to know about mixing and mastering in Logic. First, we're going to go through a little bit of an overview so you can understand how it all works together. Then we're going to jump into the individual steps of mixing, and then we'll round it out with mastering. So definitely stick around because mastering is a huge part of the process. Now, if you're someone that wants to get straight into it, you can skip ahead to part number 2, where we're actually starting the mixing process, but I highly encourage you to start with part number 1, which is the overview. Welcome back to the Band Guide. I'm your band guy, Colin, and today we're looking at the 6 steps to a pro mix inside Logic. Now, before we even get into it, I want to give you something. I put together a downloadable guide so that you don't have to keep coming back to this video anytime you're mixing. It's completely free from the link in the description below, and it just goes through these 6 steps that all professional mixes have in a quick, easy reference so you can follow along without having to come back to this. But let's go ahead and get into it, starting with step number 1, which is the static mix. Now, the static mix is the most important part of the mixing process, and the amazing thing is it's also the simplest part of the process. There is only 2 things that we're focusing on this step: our volume and our pan position. So our goal with our static mix is to make our mix sound as good as we possibly can without any plugins, without any effects. And if you get this right, your mix is going to sound great. A lot of people skip this step. They just kind of jump straight from recording into mixing by putting on EQ and compression and effects. And they don't really spend time focusing on the most powerful tool at their disposal, which is just the volume. A lot of people don't realize that volume is massively impactful to how we actually hear everything in our mix. And the relative volume of everything is everything. So if a source is quieter, it's going to sound duller. It's going to sound further away. It's not going to have as much low end. If it's louder, it's going to have more low end, more high end brightness. It's going to sound more upfront, closer to you. So if you want your drums to sound big and full and round and punchy, you need them to be at the right volume. If you want your vocal to sound upfront and present, it needs to be sitting at the right volume. And you have to get these things set at the right volume initially and then mix around them to clear everything up and get everything sitting well next to each other. But you start with just your volume and your pan position. So before you even do this, I recommend taking off any plugins that you've already set. If you put on like a Logic preset or something like that, take off anything that's not part of the sound. So if you have an amp on your guitar, leave that amp designer on your guitar. You don't want to take off that kind of stuff, but you want to take off anything that's not part of the sound. If you put in a reverb on it and it has to be part of that sound, then leave it on. But don't have reverbs all over your mix because they cloud your mix and they cloud your judgment. So we want as little intercession as we can possibly get, and then we want to bring our volume all the way down on every single track, and then we want to bring them up in order of importance. So if you have struggled with your vocals cutting through in a mix, that's probably because you've not started with your vocals early in the stage of setting your individual volumes. I never struggle with a vocal being able to be loud enough in a mix because I set my vocal volume and mix around it. So the way that I like to do it is I set my volume for the vocal, and then I mix my kick and my snare around it, then I mix my drums around it, then my low end, and then all my mid-range stuff, my guitars, my back-end vocals, all that stuff. So that's the way I would encourage you to do it as well. Now, a couple tips with this. First, you need to keep headroom at the top of your mix. So there's a digital 0 point that if your mix goes past, it just gets cut off. So you need to make sure that you keep headroom from that digital 0 point to the loudest point of your mix. And we do this by monitoring the output of our mix. My favorite way to do this is just to put the level meter plugin on my stereo output or master track or 2-bus or mix bus, whatever you want to call it. I think in Logic it defaults to being called the stereo out. You want to just put your level meter as a last plugin and keep that up the whole time you're setting your static mix. This allows you to keep an eye on that level and make sure that it never goes past -6 to -3 in the loudest section of your song. So I'd also recommend starting in the loudest section of your song, looping that section. Typically it's kind of the last chorus or something like that. Looping the loudest section of your song. That way you're not mixing in a quieter section and then you go to a louder section and now you're way too loud and it's getting past that digital 0 point. So really important to check your level and keep headroom. Tip number 2 is take advantage of wide panning. A lot of people miss this early on, but you want to have some things far left and some things far right. If you want your mix to feel big and wide, you need that width. Now you can play with this. You can have sections in your song where everything's a little bit smaller and then when it gets to the chorus, everything's big and wide, but don't be afraid to have some things far left and far right. And with that, keep in mind that you also want to have things balanced. You don't want your mix to lean off to one side too much. So if you put a guitar far left, what are you going to put in the other ear to make sure that it still feels balanced in your final mix? Now, in the guide that I linked to in the description below, the 6-step checklist to a pro mix, I have a helpful guide that gives you kind of a starting point for panning positions to get some far left and far right panning in your mix and not start throwing off your mix and making it sound unprofessional. You want to be intentional with your panning and that guide can help you out. Okay, so that is everything for the static mix. Once you finish the static mix, it is time for step number 2, which is master track processing. Now, master track processing is sometimes called top-down mixing. Either way, the idea here is that we're just doing a little bit of processing on our entire song in one place. This is going to help jumpstart a mix and make it feel like a cohesive mix that's not just a bunch of random tracks, but one mix that all gels together. So you want to find your stereo output, your master track, your 2-bus, your mix bus, whatever you want to call it. In Logic, it defaults to calling it your stereo out. You want to find that track and you just want to do a little bit of EQ and compression here. Now with EQ, we have to be super subtle. If you start to do too big of moves, it's going to start to feel very unnatural and over-processed. So I recommend maybe 1 decibel up to 3 decibel in boosts or cuts if necessary, and focus really primarily on the low end and the high end of your mix. So your sub and your bass, and then the upper shelf area where you're adding the brightness and the sheen to your mix. And again, 1 to 2 decibels, maybe 3 decibels on the high end for these EQ moves. But you can bring it up more initially, find the point that sounds good, and then scale it back down to where it's a little bit more reasonable and not making it sound over-processed. And then when it comes to compression, again, we want to be very, very subtle here. So here, I generally recommend a 30 millisecond attack time so that the initial hits can come through, somewhere around 100 millisecond release time so that it's not just moving a lot and giving a pumping sensation. And then we want to do a ratio that's somewhere around 3 to 1. You can go higher if it's rock music, lower if it's something a little bit lighter. And then you just set your threshold to where you're getting somewhere around 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction in a louder section of the song. You can go a little bit higher, push that a little bit if you want to. If it's a real rock song, you can go a little bit lower if it's a lighter song, but just a little bit. Just think of it as kissing the meter. So that meter just should be flickering a little bit in a louder section of the song. But these two plugins together are going to make your mix feel way more cohesive, way more gelled together, and it's going to get you closer to that final product before you've even done anything on any individual track. So this whole step could take you 3 minutes and your mix is going to sound better and save you time in all the other mixing that you're going to do. If you need a little more brightness on all your tracks, which is very common in a home studio recording scenario, if you need a little bit more brightness on all your tracks, if you do one shelf on the master track that brightens it all up, you might do little to no brightening on individual tracks. So it's going to save you time and help you mix faster in the end. So master track processing, do not skip it. Top-down mixing, whatever you want to call it, don't skip it. It's a really, really powerful tool. Now, before we move on to step number 3, if you like this video and you think it would be helpful to other people, be sure to like the video so that other people will see it. Help the YouTube algorithm, all that good stuff. Smash the like button. You get it. Anyway, let's move on to step number 3, which is EQ on individual channels. EQ is the most powerful tool you have inside Logic. Volume may be the most powerful thing in the mix, but EQ is the most powerful actual tool that we have inside Logic. EQ is how we shape the actual sound of everything going on. So if you want more clarity in your mix between all your instruments, you want more definition of your guitar and your kick drum and your snare drum, that's EQ. If you want your vocal to sound more present, that's EQ. If you want the kick drum to have more low end, that's EQ. If you want that bass to feel really round, you want that guitar to feel less harsh, all those things, they're all done with EQ. So it's a really, really powerful tool. But a lot of people overcomplicate it. They make it seem really, really confusing. At the end of the day, all you can really do with EQ is boost or cut. That's all you should be thinking about. So I like to think of it as 2 moves and 3 goals. Our 2 moves are boost or cut, and our 3 goals are highlight the good. So anything that we want to come through a little bit more in the mix, we highlight boost with it to minimize the bad. So if anything is kind of sounding a little bit weird or there's a little bit of too much of any sound, a lot of times in amateur mixes or home recordings, there's a little bit of a boxiness, a woofiness in the mid-range that we can kind of minimize. That helps clean it up a lot, give you less of a muddy sound to your mix. So minimize the bad, that's our second step. And our third is make space for every source. So for example, there's only so much low end that you have in your mix. And if you have all sorts of just noise coming from all the microphones in your mix, you can high pass those microphones, and that makes a little bit extra space for just clarity and punch in the low end from your kick drum and your bass and your other sources that really actually have and need that low end. So think of EQ simply as boosting or cutting, highlighting the good, minimizing the bad, and making space for every source. And with EQ, I have two big tips for you. Tip number one, if you struggle to hear EQ, boost like crazy until you hear what's really going on, and then bring down the volume of that boost to either cut if you're trying to cut, or just down to a more reasonable level. And tip number two, along lines with that, most of my EQ moves probably end up being somewhere between 4 to 6 decibels if I want it to sound fairly natural. But you want to do as little as you can, but as much as you need. So 4 to 6 decibels is fine, but if you need 9 decibels, 10 decibels, 15 decibels, that's all fine as well. So do as little as you can, but as much as you need to get it to sound the way that you want it to. Now, again, in that guide, the 6-step checklist to a Pro Mix, there is a little EQ cheat sheet that just breaks down the different sections of the EQ so you know where to go to boost or cut if you're hearing something specific. So if you're hearing kind of a boominess, where on the EQ do you actually go for that? So if you struggle with EQ, again, this guide is really going to help you out. It's completely free. But let's go move on to step number 4, which is compression. Compression is one of the least understood, least used tools by most home studio artists, but one of the most used tools by any professional mix engineer. Every song you've ever heard on the radio has compression all over it. It's a very important part in the mixing process. Now, a lot of people make compression seem very confusing, but it's actually a very simple tool. You want to think of it like an automatic volume fader, and you can use this volume fader to smooth out big peaks in audio, or make a drum punchier, cut through a little bit more in the mix, or bring out the subtleties, the quieter words in a vocal. Think of it with those 3 goals in mind. But fundamentally, it's just an automatic volume fader, but instead of you having to ride that volume fader up and down constantly, it's doing it for you. So continuing with this idea of it being an automatic volume fader, imagine a fader like you'd have on a mixing console. You set a threshold. Anytime the sound gets louder than that threshold, it's going to get turned down. How quickly it gets turned down is determined by the attack time. So if you have it wait a second before it gets turned down, then that's going to allow the sound to punch through a little bit more, like a kick drum or a snare drum, punch through a little bit more and then get turned down. So it's actually making it punchier and seem like it's cutting through more. Or if you make it really, really quick, it's going to help smooth out those big peaks that you might have in your audio. So that's great on a vocal or something that's really dynamic like that. And then how quickly it lets itself back up, it turns itself back up, is the release time. So if you want it to just quickly pop back up, that's a short release time. If you want it to slowly let itself back up and kind of turn down the stuff in between, that's a slow release time. So you could have a hit that is slow where it lets the hit through the kick drum and then it slowly releases back up. So it's released back up right before the next hit. And that's going to make each hit feel punchier and kind of turn down the stuff in between, but let that initial hit through. Okay, so the next thing to understand is the ratio. That's just how intensely it's going to turn it down. So a light ratio is going to turn it down less, a higher ratio is going to turn it down more. And then you have your makeup gain, which is just to make up the gain that you might lose because it's inherently going to be turning it down. So that's a compressor. Don't make it too complicated. Think of it as an automatic volume fader. You're just setting a threshold, how quickly it's going to turn it down, attack time, how quickly it's going to let it back up, release time, how intensely it's going to turn it down, ratio, and then the makeup gain so you're not losing any volume. That's it. That's a compressor. So a very powerful tool that seems complicated, takes a little bit to get your head around, but as long as you understand conceptually what you're doing, even if you struggle to hear the minute differences, you can set a compressor just based on the concepts of it that I just laid out. So don't be afraid of compression. It's a very important part of the mixing process. Okay, step number 5 is effects. Effects are things like reverb and delay. And a lot of people start with this way, way too early. They have a vocal, the first thing they do is slap some reverb on it. You do not want to do that because reverb literally clouds up the mix. It takes the sound and dissipates it longer throughout the mix and makes it harder to tell what's going on and what is getting muddy and all those things. If you wait until step 5 to actually start introducing effects into your mix, or at least primary effects into your mix, then you're going to have a much cleaner mix, and you'll be able to tell if things start to get muddy that it's the effects that are doing it, not anything else going on in the mix. So shape your entire mix, get it where it's feeling really, really good and nice and clear, and then build that space in around it and fill in those little gaps with effects. And if you hold off, it's going to help you out. Now, with effects, there's 4 really most common types of effects. There's small room reverbs. This is something kind of like a realistic space. The second is like a medium to long reverb. This is typically a little lusher, often a little bit more obvious, kind of filling in space, filling in gaps in a mix. Best in slower mixes in a lot of cases, or on slower sounds. Then we have a time delay. This would be something in time with the song that's like a delay. You get it. And it's in time with the song. And then we have a slapback delay. This would be a really, really fast delay that you don't necessarily obviously notice, but it's kind of giving you the effect of sound slapping back off a wall. I typically break these out into 2 camps that are more about the size of the space that it makes you think of. A small room reverb and a slapback delay create kind of a smaller sense of space. And then a medium to long reverb or a time delay give you a longer sense of space. And you can blend all 4 of these together in one mix sometimes, but often kind of finding the vibe that fits the mix, if it's going to be smaller, if it's going to be bigger, that can help it sound more cohesive. Now, 2 big tips when it comes to using effects. Tip number 1, the best effects are felt, not heard. So a lot of times the way that I set my effects is I bring them up till I start to hear them, and then I scale them back just a little bit. As soon as I start to hear it, I actually want to turn it down and make it a little less obvious. Tip number 2 is to use buses. These are huge time savers and can help create a more cohesive sound. Buses seem confusing, but are actually very, very simple. I'll link to a video I did above here where I explain everything you really need to understand about buses in about 5 minutes, so definitely check that out. But buses are basically just where you can send over to one track where you have your effect. So if you create one vocal reverb sound that you really love, you could send all your vocal tracks over to that one reverb effect, as opposed to having to put a reverb plugin and dial it in for every single plugin that's using a lot of CPU power. It's taking longer. Bus effects are just huge time savers, and because you just have one or a few tracks that you're using throughout your mix, it helps create a more cohesive sound. So that's effects. That's step number 5. And finally, we get into step number 6, which is automation. Automation is crazy. It's kind of like having a million little minions running around inside Logic, just doing things for you, turning something up, painting something off a little bit more to the right, turning your reverb up, bringing your reverb back down. Whatever you want, you can have Logic do for you and really tweak your mix to be exactly what you want it to be. Back in the day, you used to have to do this all manually while you were printing to tape, or if you had more things than you could physically do, you'd have to have an assistant come in or an intern come in and turn a knob and bring things down. And if you get it wrong, you're just printed and you can't do anything about it. You have to start all over again. But if you get it wrong inside Logic, you just continue to tweak until it's right. So really powerful. Now, you can automate just about anything. You can automate individual plugins. You could automate an EQ band, one EQ band, get really specific. But while you can do everything, I'd recommend you really just start with 3 things. The first is your vocal volume. We call this vocal writing. And the idea here is after you've set your compression, you just want to listen through your vocal in the context of your mix and listen if anything gets too loud or too quiet. If anything gets lost in the mix, just bring it up with a little bit of automation and turn it up just a little bit. If it gets too loud, you just turn it down a little bit. Another cool trick you can do here is turn up the end of phrases so that you get this real sense of closeness from the singer. So as they trail off a word, you just bring it up a little bit extra. That can really be a nice touch as well. Okay, second is our pan knob. So is there anything that we can adjust panning wise to give a little bit more width or a little less width at different points? So for example, I'll often bring my guitars in a little bit in the verses and then pop them all the way left and right in the choruses so that the choruses feel a little bit bigger and wider. So play with your pan automation. And then third is your effect automation. So very common that we make verses feel a little bit tighter, a little more intimate, a little bit smaller. And then choruses, everything balloons out and feels really huge. So I'll bring the effects down or all the way off in the verse, and then they'll come back big and strong in the choruses. Okay, so those are the 3 main areas that I would recommend automating. And the last note about automation is that the biggest mistake I see people make in mixing is that they automate their volumes way too early. you likely need to do less volume automation, and you don't know what volume automation you need to do until after you've done your compression. So hold off on automation until this very final step and just use it as a final point to tweak and perfect your mix to get as close to what you're hearing in your head as you possibly can. So that's the 6 steps: static mix, master track processing, EQ on individual channels, compression on individual channels, effects, and finally automation. Now, it's really important to know that mixing is not where we make our song loud. When you finish this mix, it's likely going to feel quiet, and that's to be expected. Mastering is where we actually bring the volume level up to a commercial volume. So don't worry when you finish this mix that it's quiet. Then it's time for mastering, and we'll talk about that coming up soon. But first, if this video is helpful, be sure to leave a comment and like this video to make sure that more people can see this. And if you know anyone else looking to get better at making music inside Logic, then be sure to share this with them. I'd love to hear from you. Are there any of these steps that you've been missing that you're excited to start implementing into your mixing process? Let me know in the comments below, and just let me know if this is helpful in general. I'd love to know that this video is helpful to people. And be sure to grab the 6-step checklist to a pro mix. It's really going to help you out. But let's go ahead and jump into actually mixing this song, starting with step 1, which is the static mix. The static mix is the first and most important part of the mixing process, but a lot of people completely skip it, or at least don't give it the time and attention it deserves. If you're not familiar with the static mix, this is just where the only thing you're doing is setting your volume and pan positions. A lot of people, they just run straight from the recording process straight into mixing, but they haven't really made sure that they've set their individual levels at the appropriate levels relative to each other and relative to the headroom you need to keep at the top of your mix. And so then they're fighting against the headroom or fighting against the relative levels of everything in the mix to get the right things to cut through. They are basically shooting themselves in the foot before they even start mixing. And beyond that, if you haven't really set your individual volumes and your pan positions appropriately, then you don't really know what you need to be doing in the mix. Once you've set your volumes, you can kind of get into the mix and figure out where things are getting covered up, and you might need to use EQ to help bring them out, or to maybe remove something from something else so that everything can be clear and full and present in your mix, or what kind of effects you want, what levels those effects should be. If you haven't set your individual volumes at the levels that they should be, then all you're doing is individually processing tracks kind of randomly. You might get your kick drum to sound great on its own, you might get your acoustic guitar to sound great on its own, your vocal to sound great on its own, but when you put everything together, it doesn't actually work together because you just worked on them individually. Getting your static mix set first allows you to jump into your mix and really figure out where those issues are and then address those, as opposed to just randomly making individual elements in solo sound better, but not everything sound better altogether. So the static mix is incredibly important, and it's something that you need to put your time and attention to. And in today's video, we're going to go through an entire static mix together so you can see exactly how to do it. Okay, let's go and jump into Logic and start on the static mix. Now, before we start the static mix, there's 3 things we need to do. The first is remove any pre-mixing that's not part of the sound. So if you pulled up a preset while you're recording vocals, or just to kind of get a quick feel for the mix, take all that stuff off. You don't want anything that's not crucial to the sound of the source. So you can see in my session here, we basically have no processing going on. I'm not sending off to any effects. It's very, very basic. And that's important because we want as much clarity and as few things going on during this part of the mixing process as we can get. So all you really should have is something that's part of the sound. So obviously, like an amp on a guitar track, we're going to keep that stuff on. So if it's not part of the sound, take it off. We want to go as raw as we can, and that's going to give us the clarity to know what we need to do in the mix as we get further into the mixing process. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that we want to set a level meter on our master track, or stereo output as Logic calls it in default. We're just going to go over here down to metering and find the level meter. And I like to set it as the last plugin on this track so that I can put processing before it later in this process. And then what I like to do is just turn it vertical and then pop it up in the top right corner. And then I just keep it up the whole time that I'm mixing. That way, no matter where I am in the session, I can see the exact volume of my output on the master track. Now, we want to keep this between -6 to -3. Digital 0 is a point that if sound goes past it, it just gets cut off. So we need to keep that proper headroom to make sure that we're not having our signal cut off. And if we need to turn up anything later on in the mixing process, we're like, oh man, that vocal still isn't cutting through as much as I'd like for it to, I just need to bring it up a little bit. We have the space, that headroom to do that. Okay, crucial part of this process. And then the third and final thing, and I know you're going to resist this because I did for years, I just didn't do it for years, and it definitely held my mixes back, is we want to bring all our volumes all the way down. We want to start fresh and bring things in with intention, paying attention to the exact thing that we're pulling up the volume of and where it's living inside the mix. So in Logic, this is very simple to do. First thing you need to do is if you have any sort of folders, track stacks like this Logic Producer Kit here, you need to fold it open so that you can see all those tracks. And then we want to not select the track stack itself, but select all the tracks within it and then all the other tracks in your session. And I'm just going to hold Shift on the keyboard to pull all the way over to the end, and now I've selected every track. And then we want to hold Option on the keyboard and click on the faders, and that's going to put them all at 0. And then we can bring everything down together so that everything comes down evenly. Otherwise, it will keep the same relative volumes if you bring up multiple tracks at once, which can just throw things off and kind of throw you off later in the process. So hold Option as you click on a fader, bring them all back up to unison, and then bring them all down. I know it's scary, but we did it together. And then the next thing we need to do is put any pan positions that you're not 100% sure on back to 0, and we want to set them intentionally inside the mix. So in this case, all these vocals here at the end, we recorded them with the intention of where they're going to live in the mix. So I'm going to leave those as they are. But like these two vocals here, I'm not exactly sure if that's where I want those to live. So I'm going to hold Option and click on the pan knob, and it's going to put them back up to center. And then let's look at this view actually. I think the synths here might pan further, they might pan narrower, so I'll play with that as well. And I think that's it. I know where my toms are going to live. I want them like that, the hi-hat off to the side. So that's it. Okay, so now everything is basically fresh, and now it's time to start the static mix. So let's throw my headphones on. With the static mix, as I said, we want to keep -6 to -3 headroom at the top of our mix, and you want to bring in the most important things in the mix first, which for most pop and rock songs, your vocal, your kick, and your snare, and then if you have a lead synth or lead like guitar line that is really important, you want to go ahead and bring that in as well. For us here, it's just going to be the lead vocal, the kick, and the snare. And you want to make sure that you're doing this in the loudest section of the song. So in this case, we're in this kind of big bridge area. This is technically the loudest section of the song, but typically it's going to be your last chorus or your last part of the bridge. That's going to be your loudest area. So somewhere near the end of the song in most songs. Okay, we've set that to loop. Now I'm going to let it play. I'm going to go back to the lead vocal here and bring it up to unison. And then I'm going to go up to the drums and start bringing in the kick and the snare.
For you,
bring this down a little bit.
Baby, it isn't all.
Bring up this snare top and bottom.
It isn't all. Baby, we're not on call.
It's feeling pretty good, but notice that we're already at -3.6, and I only have basically 3 elements in, kick, snare, and vocal. So I'm going to select all these tracks here, the kick, snare, and the vocal down here. And we're just going to bring it down right now. The vocal's at 0, so I'm just going to bring it down 3 decibels, so it's -3. And that will give me somewhere around -6.
Baby, we're not on
so again, now we're in a nice safe level over here. Let's go and bring in the overheads.
Baby, we're not on call for you.
The tom here, the low tom.
Baby, it is.
Let's go to a section that has a little more toms on it.
And now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud.
I kind of like loud toms personally.
We're all getting sick of it, yeah.
Let's go back to that section.
Proud, yeah,
Drum room. Drum room is a huge part of the drum mix.
It, yeah.
Let's bring up this grit track here. Cool. Let's go to that louder section at the end.
Baby, we're not on call.
Those drums feel good to me. I like the sound of that. The grit track is adding a lot. Let's go and bring in this tambourine real quick. Let's bring in this bass bomb. It's just like a sub hit. Let's do that one more time. Cool. And we're still safe on our meter there. And then let's bring in this digital drum.
Baby, we're not on. Baby, we're on call.
And then from there, we're going to bring in our bass sources, our mid-range sources, and then the rest of the vocals. That's the way I like to work. So, bass. Still good on a peak level. A little loud, bring it down a little bit. With the synth bass here.
isn't all.
It's a fun little trick. I'd recorded this already and I wanted it to go up an octave, but I hadn't recorded it that way. This is an old track. And so when I was producing it later, I was like, it would be cool if it went up an octave. What if I use a whammy pedal to give it that slide effect? Anyway.
'Cause baby, we're not on call.
So this guitar is going to be center. Kind of want it to be tucked a little bit. Guitar left and right. Let's see if these are sitting equal. So in solo, I just want to be seeing if my level looks like it's leaning a little bit to the right. The right ear's a little bit louder. So I'm going to just like one track, bring the left up so it's sitting equal. You want to balance both looking at it visually and also listening to make sure that it looks right. But you don't want to have things start to lean off to one side if you can avoid it. That's how you're going to have a nice even feeling mix left to right.
Baby, we're not on call. Baby, we're not on call. Baby, we're not on Baby, it isn't all. Baby, it isn't.
So some of these relative levels. Cool. Let's go to a section that has this little guitar lead tails. This is from an old demo and just sounded cool, blended in with the lead, the new lead. See, we're just over -6. It's still totally fine. Let's go and bring in this piano here. Cool. And then let's bring in this left and right element here. These are meant to be kind of balanced against each other. Pan left, right. Looks like we're a little bit louder on the left, so I'm just going to bring the right up a little bit. I'm okay if it's leaning a little bit, but I want it to be fairly balanced. It feels pretty good to me. A little loud. A little bit. Turn that tambourine down just a little bit. Just bring in this vocal double.
Not settled down at all.
Let's listen to another area with the vocal double.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names,
Feels pretty good. It's supposed to be kind of an obvious double. With this left and right vocal here. Pull these up.
You say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. Now you say
Check where they come into the bridge here.
baby, we're not on call.
That goes away.
On call.
Let's make sure they're good in solo. Left and right.
On call.
Cool.
Baby,
Let's bring in the lead vocal and this low.
not settle down at all.
Let's listen to the context.
Settle down at all. That you might not settle down at all. Yeah.
This is kind of a cool. This is recorded like from the other side of the room, so it kind of has a bit of a room sound. Let's try playing off to the right just a little bit.
Yeah.
Kind of dig that. Helps it stand out. Cuts it a little bit better.
Not settle down at all.
Helps separate it from the lead vocal.
Yeah. 'Cause young.
Cool. And then down here we have the chorus vocals. So we're gonna do these in solo. I'm gonna bring up the lead vocal. What I want to do is get a good balance across all of these, and then I can adjust their level up or down in the mix. So, but get the balance relative to each other in solo. We have a left and right here. Bring those up together. Let's go back here. Feels pretty good. Let's go and bring in these here. This is again kind of like that far room sound. So he's singing at the wall faced away from the microphone to give it a sense of space. Let's go and solo these all together again. A couple harmonies here. Let's bring these up. And then this left and right here. One more time. I think that left is a little bit louder. Feels good to me. Okay, let's listen to the context now. A little bit hot in general. Just like all of them. Bring them down just a little bit. I actually really want that lead guitar line to be kind of equally prominent to the vocal line. Alright, and the final thing here is... off a little bit to the right. I kind of want this one to feel far away, so I want it to be lower in the mix. Quieter gives us a sensation or perspective that it is further away. So let's check that out. Okay, now looks like we just have some synth elements. Let's go and bring these in here. If you're ever not sure if something is at the right volume, try muting it and seeing if you notice it disappear. Something like that that's kind of supposed to be tucked, but we definitely still want to be getting kind of that fullness from that synth. It's a little hard to hear, like notice it in the context of the mix, but by muting it, it kind of becomes obvious that it's gone. Cool. All right. You can see here we're at negative 4.4, so we're still in that safe range, negative 3 to negative 6. But let's say you got a little bit past, let's say you're at negative 1, you hadn't hit digital 0 yet. You could bring this entire mix down without grabbing every fader by going to the top here, going to utility, adding just a gain plugin, and then just bringing this down here by a couple of decibels. In our case, we're safe where we are, so I'm gonna go and take that off. But that is something that's an option if you need to bring the entire mix down a little bit. You don't have to grab every track and bring them all down. Although you can, again, just by grabbing this track and going all the way back to the beginning, selecting this track, and just bringing them all down together very, very subtly, very gently. The idea with the static mix is that you're just massaging everything into place until it feels really good, feels like you want it to. How do you know when you're done? Well, one, you'd want to listen through the entire mix, so I'm going to do that before I move on, but I won't do that with you just for sake of your time. But I listen through the entire mix and make sure that it feels right at the different areas in the song. And it's okay if it's maybe a little quiet here, a little loud there, as long as the overall feels really good, because we're going to automate some stuff at the very end, and compression is going to help address some of those disparities in volume. But you want it to feel good throughout the song, and you kind of want to be like moving along to it. You want to be enjoying the mix without all the fluff. You're just kind of feeling everything, you're hearing everything, and it feels like the song that you tried to create. As long as you've done that, then you've done a good job creating this mix. So let's go ahead and move on to the second step in the mixing process, master track processing. Top-down mixing, or master track processing as I prefer to call it, is a great way to jumpstart your mix so that it's closer to the final version of the mix before you start doing anything on individual channels, and to kind of glue it together so it feels like one cohesive mix that's breathing together as opposed to just a bunch of tracks. This is a very simple step in the mixing mixing process that you do not want to skip, and you want to do it at the beginning of the mixing process and mix through it. If you don't already have it, be sure to grab my 6-step checklist to a pro mix. It's just a simple guide that goes through these same 6 steps so you can easily and quickly reference back to it anytime you're mixing. And if you're following this in real time, it gives you all 6 steps right now, but it allows you to quickly reference it so you don't have to keep coming back to these videos every time you're mixing. It's free from the link in the description below, so be sure to pick it up. Let's go and jump into Logic and start doing some master track processing. So here's our session. If you've been following along, you know all we've done so far is the static mix, so we don't really have any processing on individual channels yet, but we've set all of our individual channel levels and our pan positions and all that stuff so that we have a good mix, relative balance across all the tracks, and enough headroom at the top. So it's really important to do this before doing any sort of master track processing. Okay, now a quick thing that I highly recommend you do before you jump into master track processing is actually export your song out, bounce it out. Now I'm going to set my cycle region here to just be the whole duration of the song from the very, very beginning, so I can drop it right at the beginning of the session, and then it's okay as long as it ends after the song ends. You don't have to be too technical with this. And then we're just going to hit bounce down here, and you want to make sure you have PCM selected, file format wave, and then I just like to make sure that dithering is set to none, and then we'll hit OK. Pay attention to where you're bouncing this. We're just going to call this the static mix, and it will take a second to bounce out. We're going to re-import that into our session, and what this gives us is a really quick way to easily reference back to our static mix without any of the processing as we're getting further along into the mixing process, so that we know we're moving the mix into the right direction. This gives us very important perspective so that we know we're moving in the right direction, and there's not something from the raw tracks that maybe actually sounded better before we started doing processing. And if we have this as something we can easily and quickly reference back to anytime, then it's just going to help us continue to make sure that our mix is getting better and better and never actually moving backwards. Okay, so now that it's exported out, we're just going to go down to the bottom of our session here. We're going to find that file in the Finder, so be sure to pay attention to where it is you're saving it, and we're just going to drag it in to the very beginning of our session, and it will take a second to import. We'll go ahead and hit mute, and now what I can do is I can easily switch back and forth between the static mix and our full mix, and again, as we continue to move through the mixing process, this will give me an easy way to reference that. So if I solo it, we're listening to the static mix here that we exported out. If I unsolo it, we're going to hear what's actually going on in our session. Okay, and then one more thing before we get into it, we're also going to save a project alternative. So we're going to go up here to File, Project Alternatives, and we're just going to hit New Alternative, and we will call this one Master Track Processing or top-down mixing, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so now it's finally time to actually do some master track processing. So your master track, we're going to find in your mix view here, and it's going to be the next to last track in your session. So your last track here is your master track or your stereo output or your 2-bus, whatever you want to call it. If you bring it over from GarageBand, it will default to being called your master track. If you're coming in from Logic, it will likely just be called your stereo output. No matter what, it's going to be this track here, and this is the track that your entire song runs through. If you're not positive you're on that track, a quick way to check it is we can listen to your song and we can mute it, and if it mutes everything, then it's probably your master track. Now, when it comes to master track processing, there's 2 things that every professional mix, or nearly every professional mix, has on their master track, and kind of a third bonus thing that's really, really easy to kind of just integrate into the process that we'll look at the end. The first is EQ. EQ is how we shape the tone of our mix, and we don't want to be doing a lot here with EQ, so first thing we're going to do is just open up our EQ. Now with this, I encourage you to think of your EQ largely in 3 broad areas. You have your bass, you have your mids, and then you have your treble, kind of like a car stereo. So our bass is over here on the left, we have our mids in the middle, and then we have our treble on the far end. With your master track, you don't really want to be getting into the weeds and doing anything surgical. You want to just be doing a gentle lift in the areas that need it. Now, this is going to depend on your song, but for a lot of songs, modern mixes, this is going to mean a little bit more low end and a little bit more high end. Again, if you end up having way more low end in your song, or you want less low in your song, you might not end up wanting to do that move. But those are the 2 areas that I encourage you to look at. This is sometimes called the smiley face curve EQ. So the main area that we're going to look at is kind of 100 and below, and we're going to do that on a shelf, which lifts everything from here and below. So what I like to do is just find where it's giving me the right kind of feeling in the low end and just do a gentle bump. So I might exaggerate it to hear it and then scale it back to be a little bit more reasonable. So in a lot of cases with our master track, we don't want to be doing moves over maybe 3 decibels. And sometimes you might be doing a 1 decibel bump, just a very, very subtle bump. But these moves across your entire mix add up to being a nice, gentle push in the right direction. This is like jump starting a mix. And what this allows us to do is do less of these low end and high end bumps on individual tracks and get a lot of that work done here in one place on the master track. So let's find this point here. somewhere right around 90 hertz is working for me on this song, and a bump of about 2 decibels is enough that I'm feeling the benefit, but it's not overwhelming the low end. So as little as you can, but as much as you need, but on the master track, you want to keep that nice and subtle. Okay, the next area is going to be up in this high end area, and typically there's some mixes that I might be doing just a little lift way up high here. In other mixes like this, I might bring it down into the more 2-3K range, but you just want to play around with it exaggerated, find where it feels good or starts to feel harsh, and maybe back it away from that area. And if it's feeling really good, then that's probably the right area to be in. So we're going to start up high and bring it down until I start to notice it maybe adding stuff I don't want it to add, and I'll scale it back and then scale back the amount. So notice right here, it starts to feel maybe slightly harsh. But if I come up here, it stops feeling harsh. So that's a good indicator. I don't want to get into that area. I probably want to tailor that area a little more specifically on individual tracks. I'm just going to do a little bit of a lift right here. Okay, and the last thing we're going to do is just balance the output volume. So I'm going to turn it down so it's the same volume off and on. Check that out. Let's go back to earlier in the song here. Okay, so all I did was turn it down just a little bit, about a decibel, and now it's the same volume, or roughly the same volume, off and on. We don't want to just do boosts that then trick our ears to thinking it sounds better just because it's actually making it a little bit louder. So now I can honestly and accurately assess, do I like the sound of what this EQ is adding to this? So check that out. This is off. This is on. As soon as you click it on, it just feels a little bit cleaner, a little bit fuller, a little higher fidelity, almost like you took a little bit of a blanket off the sheets, right? It gives you a little bit of that effect. So that's EQ, very, very simple, very small moves here, and you're focusing broadly, generally, in most mixes around the low end and the high end. Okay, let's talk about the second element, which is gluing our mix together with a little bit of compression. Now, for this, you want to make sure that you're centered around a louder section in the song, so I'm going to just go up here and bring this back to just be this area. Otherwise, if you set this in a quieter section of the song, you might end up setting your compressor to work in a quieter section, but then when it gets to the louder section, it's pushing it way too hard. So set it in a louder section and then check it in other areas of your song. So we're going to go here and just pull up the default under Dynamics compressor here, and we'll do it in stereo. And my preference, my favorite, is the vintage VCA. This is kind of like an SSL model, I'm pretty sure. First thing you want to do is turn auto gain off. Then you want to set your threshold all the way up so that it's not compressing initially, and we'll dial it back. I like to set my attack time to about 30 milliseconds. This is important because what you're doing here is you're allowing that initial hit through. You're not clamping down on all those initial hits. And that allows them to still kind of pump and have a little bit of motion. But as soon as it passes that threshold, let it through and then bring it back down just a little bit. So it kind of breathes with them in a way that's nice without kind of cutting off the hits. The next area, sometimes I will leave this on auto. In this case, I'm going to turn it off and I'm going to set it around 100 millisecond release, which is fairly fast for a master bus compressor, but I find that it's slow enough that it's not pumping. So if you have it too fast, it's going to be like turning down really quickly and you're going to feel it coming back up where it shouldn't. So around 100 milliseconds tends to be kind of a sweet spot. It's based on the SSL G-Bus compressor. And then anywhere 2-to-1 up to about 4-to-1 on most mixes work. And I typically, as a starting point, set this based on genre and kind of style of the mix. So with a light, super light acoustic-y mix, I might be going 2-to-1, maybe even 1.8-to-1, really light down on that side. So down over here. And then as I get more rock, I will move it up and up. This song is, kind of like a pop rock song. So 3-to-1 or 4-to-1, I think is going to be the sweet spot. We'll go and leave it about 4-to-1 here. And then we're just going to set our threshold and our makeup gain, and that's going to allow us to kind of dial in the amount that we want on our meter here. So with this, in the loudest section of your song, you probably only want to be getting 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction on this meter. So as this is playing here, I just want to be getting, as I bring my threshold down, somewhere around here. We can maybe get a little bit more on some of the louder hits. And And then we're just going to dial in just a little bit of makeup gain so that it's the same volume off and on. And you can kind of get an initial idea based on the input versus output. So we can look at that here. Input is around negative 3.6. Over here it's about negative 4. So we can maybe do 1.5. So use that as your initial indicator, and then also check with your ears. So now if I turn this off and back on, back on, it doesn't sound louder, but it does sound a little bit fuller, a little bit more upfront, a little bit more present, right? That's the whole idea here. And just these two moves, so just our EQ and our compression, if I turn this off, listen to how much it impacts the mix. So I'll have it off and then I'll engage it, and notice when it comes on, you're going to get a little bit of movement, and it's going to kind of glue together, and it's going to feel a little bit higher fidelity from the EQ moves. Check that out. This is off, kind of muffled. Feel the kick drum kick through a little bit more. Off. Back on. So it definitely adds to the mix already. We've moved our mix in the right direction. The kick drum's kicking through a little bit. The tone shaping moves us to a more final sound, not totally polished yet, but more polished sounding than before. And all we did was two very simple things, EQ and compression. Now, I mentioned there's a third thing that's kind of like a bonus thing, and that's saturation. This is something you can dial in and of itself, but what's really cool about this built-in stock compressor in Logic is it has these vintage emulations, and this distortion over here, what it really is saturation, as long as you don't push it too hard. And so if we switch this over to soft, we're going to add a little bit of volume, but we're going to get a little bit of that analog saturation as if we were running through an analog piece of gear in the real world. And so what I like to do is set it to soft and then just dial my output gain. I found it's about 2 decibels, seems to be offsetting the volume that this extra saturation adds. And that's just going to give us a little bit more presence and a little bit more warmth to the mix, as if we'd recorded through some amount of analog gear. Okay, so let's check this out again now, off and on with that saturation dialed in. This is off. Back on. Off. Back Pretty cool, right? 2 little moves and a little bit of saturation, and we're getting way more clarity, fullness, and punch in our mix already before we even start doing anything on individual channels. Okay, so now that we've finished the master track processing, let's jump into individual channels and start doing a little bit of EQ. EQ is the most powerful tool in our mix. If you want your vocals to sound clearer and more upfront, a big part of that is EQ. If you want your guitars to sound less harsh, a big part of that is EQ. If you want more weight and low end in your kick drum, you get the point. EQ is super powerful. And the reality is that usually it's not huge moves that drastically transform things. It's really subtle moves, but across an entire mix, it's amazing the impact it has. Now, if you've been enjoying this series, or at any point in this video, if you think this is really helpful and I hope other people see this, could you be sure to like this video? It makes a huge difference in making sure that this video gets shown to more people who it could really help out. So if you like this video at any point, be sure to like it, or just go ahead and like it right now. And if you really, really don't like it, just go ahead and hit that dislike button twice. Anyway, let's go and jump into Logic. Now, if you're not really familiar with EQ, it may look intimidating, but it's actually a very simple tool. Really, all we can do is either boost or cut. So we can go to any point across the frequency spectrum, which is super lows down on this side up to super highs up on this side, and we can either boost or we can cut. Basically, bring it out more in the mix or kind of reduce it in the mix. So I like to think of it as a tool that's going to help us minimize bad things, highlight good things, so boost them, or make space for every source, because there's a lot of things that might have a little extra sound that it doesn't need in the mix, and by cutting that out, we're actually making space for other sources that do need that part of the sound. So for the obvious example that you've probably heard 1,000 times is a source like your vocal doesn't need this super low end here. Anything that's down there is just going to be kind of rumble, but it's going to be taking up energy and space in the mix that could get in the way of the kick drum and the bass guitar that does need those frequencies from really having the space that they need in the mix. So by cutting all the sources that don't need that, you're inherently making a little bit more space in the mix. This also could be cutting out some high frequencies. I often do this on electric guitars, things like that. So don't be intimidated by EQ. Again, all you're doing is either boosting or cutting, and you're minimizing things that don't sound good to you, highlighting things that do sound good to you that you want to bring out in the mix a little bit more, and then making space for everything to sit together. This is how you get good separation and clarity and kind of a cleanness in your mix. If you've heard of a clean mix, that's a big part of it. Okay, so that's broad strokes EQ, but if you're still confused about EQ, be sure to grab my 6-step checklist to a pro mix from the link in the description below. In it, it has a little EQ cheat sheet that goes through the different zones of EQ and where to go if you're trying to bring out or reduce a certain sound. So if you have too much boominess, it tells you exactly where on the EQ to go to bring that down. If it's a little bit harsh, has a tinniness to it, where to go to bring that down. So definitely pick up the free 6-step checklist to a pro mix. It also just goes through all the 6 steps that we're doing throughout this series, so you can easily, quickly reference back to it so that you don't have to just keep coming back to these videos anytime you're doing a mix. Again, free from link in the description below, so be sure to pick that up. But let's go and jump in and start actually applying some EQ throughout the mix. So the first thing that you need to do before you ever actually apply EQ is listen and decide if you need EQ on something. I typically start with the drums in the mix, so let's listen, focusing on these drums in the context of the mix and in solo, and determine if there's anything we feel like these drums need. Check it out. Okay, so overall, I think the drums sound good. I don't think they need a lot, but I do feel like that kick drum needs a little bit more low end. I want the snare to have a little bit more body to it, and maybe a little less. There's almost like a fizziness up in the upper mid-range area, the high-end frequencies, is a little bit weird to me. So probably address those two things. Maybe some paperiness to the toms. I want to listen to a section here that's a little more tom-focused in solo. So yeah, so these toms are a little bit papery, not massively, but I think by just cutting a little bit of like the mid-range 500-ish boxiness range, it's going to fix that for us. So let's go and start with these drums, and we'll start in solo focusing on the weight of the kick drum. Now, this is a producer kit, so I have this track stack, which allows me to process the entire drum kit together. So I'm going to do that for the low end of these drums, and we're going to focus just down in this area to start. So once I start getting up here, it sounds a little bit boomy to me. Somewhere around here is nice. So I'm going to dial that back to a little bit more reasonable. Turn that off. Back on. Yeah, you feel that kick drum just kind of hitting a little bit harder now. Now, I personally like to do a little bit of a high-pass filter on my kick drum, or just the low end on my drums in general, to make sure that it's not extending on forever into frequencies that I can't necessarily hear particularly well. That way I know it's not adding a bunch of additional rumble in the low end. Okay, so I think for the low end of that kick drum, that's feeling pretty good, but now I'm listening to this in solo, I think I might want to bring out a little bit more mid-range in the snare, kind of like a nasally sound almost. I think that's probably gonna be around here. Yeah. Kind of almost a nasty sounding frequency. Let's listen to this in the context of the mix. It's kind of gross, but it almost makes it feel less digital and sound a little bit more real. But take that away. Add it back in. Yeah, there's something cool about that frequency range. Okay, so the last thing we do, now that we found our frequencies, is dial the output gain here to make sure that we're not adding volume, and now I can accurately assess whether or not I like what this EQ is doing. Let's listen here. So this is off. Back on. Yeah, feels a lot more polished in a weird way. More low end, a little bit more bite up here. Cool, okay. So I feel pretty good about that. Let's go and look into getting a little bit more beef on this snare drum. Now I prefer to do this directly on a snare drum because it's typically in this 200-ish range, and that frequency range can be a little bit boomy on kick drum. So I prefer to attack this more directly on the snare drum. It's gonna be somewhere around this fundamental, which is the lowest pitch of the snare. drums in solo. Add that back in. And then balance the output gain. I'm okay if it's not perfectly balanced on this one because I like the overall level of the upper frequencies here, and I just want a little bit more of that body. Cool. Yeah. Dig it. Oh yeah, there's also kind of like this almost, I mean, it is a virtual drum, but almost fakey sounding thing going on. I think kind of up here. Let's listen to it in the whole drum context. So maybe bring that down a little bit. Let's see if... I don't think I want to make up for it in any way. I think I overall like the sound of that better now. It's a little bit muffled, so we're just going to dial that back a little bit. Cool. Cool. A lot fuller sounding on the snare. All right, let's address the floor tom paperiness. So let's go here on this floor tom. And let's listen to the context of the whole drum kit. So that's going to be somewhere around here. Yeah, somewhere right around there. So just cut that down a little bit. And then I'm also going to give it just a little extra load. I really like beefy toms. So I'm just going to go down in the super low end region. Now I've done a cut and a boost, so this is probably about the same volume off and on. Yeah. In solo, off, on. It's just a little bit more focused. Okay, and then let's check the high tom just a little bit there as well. Take this out of solo.
Get out of the thick.
Actually, it's not really bothering me in the same way in the rack tom. So for now, I'm going to leave it. I might change that in the future, but for now, I'm going to leave it. You can always add more EQ later, but it's a little bit harder to undo it if you do too much early on. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'm going to skip all these because I'm fine. These are just good sounding samples. Let's jump up to this bass guitar. Determine if we need EQ here. Overall, I actually really like the sound of this bass. I feel like it's cutting through well, but I think I do want just a little bit more of that low end from it. So let's see if we can bring out just a little bit more. Let's go to this area here. And do the same thing in high pass just to make sure it's not extending down forever into the low end here. Just a little bit of a bump around 1K. So these are the two frequency ranges, somewhere like 60 to 80 hertz down in the low end, bringing in that sub of a kick or a bass guitar, and then somewhere around 1K, bringing in the presence of it. Balance the output gain just a little bit. Immediately the mix just kind of feels fuller. That really fills it up well. Okay, again, I'm pretty happy with this synth bass sound, so I think I'm just gonna leave it as is. Let's start jumping into some of these guitars. Let's start with this left-right guitars here. So this guitar on the left here, it already has an EQ on it just to help tame some of this like low mid stuff. This was, or really bass stuff. This is from when we were tracking it. Just felt like it needed a little bit less of that, so I left it because it was part of the sound when I started mixing it. Okay, so with these guitars, I'm gonna cut a little bit of the high end out up here. This will make a little bit more space for my cymbals and my vocals. And all I'm really cutting is this like super fizzy stuff up here. So somewhere around there. Sometimes I'll go lower with this, but I think on this guitar, somewhere around 6K is feeling pretty good. And then I think I just need to address a little bit of the harshness, somewhere around 2K. So I boost kind of wide and then I narrow once I'm really hearing it. Otherwise, everything sounds weird if you boost too narrow. People tell you to boost like this, everything sounds weird like that. So I never boost like that, I boost broad and then zero in once I've started to notice it. So right around there, right around 2K is a very common place. This is where ears are really sensitive. Okay, so now I'm just gonna cut that. Let's see. Yeah, take that back. Just a little bit harsh. You don't miss it when it's gone. Let's see if we can bring out a little bit more low mids from these guitars without them getting kind of muddy. So I think somewhere around here, just a little bit of a bump, about 3 decibels. Okay, so this is off. Off, back on. Just a little bit more contained. Right here, I'm actually going to use that other EQ as a starting point on this one, so I'm just going to copy it over. Since it's similar overall tone. Yeah, this is, let's see about this specific cut here. Yeah, it's like right on that same frequency. Okay. So just cutting that a little bit. You hear that fizz just cleaning up immediately. Cool. So those 2 EQs, pretty big difference. Really cleans them up and makes them feel a little bit fuller. Cool. Let's grab this guy. Now, this guy is meant to be a little bit more in the high-end range, so I'm not going to do a full cut, but I'm going to maybe just do a little bit of a shelf to reduce it a little bit. So instead of filtering it all the way out, I'm just reducing it. Just balancing it a little bit, and then I'm going to address that harshness somewhere around here. It's a little bit lower on this one, but it's kind of just this whole range, I think. There. So let's actually do 2. I think around here, make it a little bit narrower. You don't want to start doing a lot of cuts like this because you're going to really make your sources sound weird, but you just need to address a little bit of that harshness. Yeah, right around there. So a little bit higher than the other guitars. Yeah, much smoother. I actually don't know if I need to do anything on this guitar. For now, I'm going to leave this guitar. I don't think it needs anything. So I'm going to take this EQ back off. Let's go with this lead here. Let's go put the EQ at the end of all the effects. Actually, let's throw it after the amp, but before the delay and reverb. It's on that amp. I'm just going to cut out some of this low end here. And it's a lead track, so I'm going to leave in more of this high end. I do want to listen to what it's doing in other parts of the song. So let's find that same lead. Right around here. Yeah, overall like what it's doing there. And I'm not getting in the way with this high pass. Help fill it out just a little bit. I'm going to cut just a little bit on the output volume. Yeah. Cool. And then these are all just related. So that's all the guitars. Let's go and bring out a little bit more of this keyboard, this piano here. High pass a little bit. Just a little bit. Cool. Let's listen to all these in context here, or just in solo, I mean. I don't know if I need to do anything on any of these sounds. Maybe I'll change my mind in the future, but again, I can always come back to that. Okay, let's zero in on these vocals. Let's actually go to this verse here, I think.
Instead of crying at the table.
So with this vocal, I want a little bit more body out of the vocal and a little less of like the mid-range boxiness.
Instead of lying that you're stable.
So I'm gonna cut out, make sure there's no rumble in the low end here.
You say it's just
To do this, you just wanna make sure you don't start cutting into the signal with things that you want. It's okay if you're cutting in the signal some, especially if it's helping the sound. But in this case, I don't wanna get into the body of his vocal here.
Get out,
Some vocals I will.
out of the thick of it.
This feels good and safe. When he slides down, he's not getting down past this high
Now you're
pass here.
saying you're proud.
But I think the big thing I want to cut is something around this boxiness around here.
Table. Instead of pushing it away. You say it's just to get out. Yeah, it's just to get out. Out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're proud. Yeah, you're saying you're proud.
That might be all I need to do on this vocal.
I'll get
Let's go later in the song here. I'm gonna bring in a little bit more air. Let's listen to that in the verse here.
Instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, you say it's just to get out. Yeah, it's just to get out.
Yeah.
Out of the
So a little extreme brightness up here in solo.
and now you're saying you're proud. Yeah,
Off.
you're saying you're proud.
All I'm doing is that one cut there, but it feels fuller because I'm hearing more of these low frequencies. Less of this boxiness here, and then some of the super air that makes that vocal feel really upfront and present. Let's go ahead and listen to this double here.
Cigarettes. Instead of lying that you're stable,
I feel like that vocal has kind of the
Instead
same
of pushing it
boxiness
away.
thing.
and you say it's just to get out.
So I'm
Yeah,
gonna-
it's just to get out.
Cut that same range there.
Out of the thick of it.
And then I'm going to leave this main double fairly bright, but not add that super present boost up in the top end.
And now you're saying you're proud. Yeah, you're saying you're proud.
Yeah, I think overall this
All
sounds pretty good to
getting
me.
sick of it, yeah.
I do actually, I think on that lead vocal, I want to bring in just a little bit more of this kind of 2K presence range. Let's listen in the context of the mix here. Let's go back up to this section.
Baby, we're not on call. Baby, we're not on call.
So this is like
Baby, we're not
this
on
presence boost right
call.
here. That's where our ears are most sensitive, so it's a great way to get your vocals to really cut through without necessarily adding too much additional volume.
Baby, we're not on call.
Back just a little bit. Okay. And then I already got this double here. I'm going to copy the exact same setting from this double to the left and the right double, but I'm actually going to cut out a little bit of the high end. So let's focus first on this left ear.
Baby, we're not on call. Baby, we're not on.
This is going to tuck them a little bit down in the mix, but still let them fill up the sides of the mix. Sometimes I make them bright, but a lot of times I kind of dip them down and make them a little bit darker than the lead vocal. So the lead vocal takes up all that,
On call.
all the bright
Baby,
frequencies.
we're not on.
That's all up the center, really emphasize, and then on the sides, it's just adding weight to that vocal, fullness to that vocal. Cool.
Baby, we're not on.
Let's go to these vocals real quick.
And you think
Got a low octave here.
not
Can you hear that vocal
settle
tuning?
down
A little bit.
at
So
all.
high pass is a little bit lower here to make sure I get that fundamental. Let's see, go back to the start of that phrase.
'Cause you're young and you think that you might not settle down
Just a little bit of that same boxiness, but not much.
Yeah.
And then this, I want this to be prominent, so I might boost some of the,
Not settle down at all. Yeah.
just a little bit of these prominent frequencies to make our ears a little bit more sensitive to it.
That you might not settle down at all.
Yeah, it just cleans it up a little bit, makes it a little more upfront and present.
Yeah.
Let's listen to this far one.
Think that you might
Cut that low end.
not settle down at all.
This one has like a weirdness to it that I kind of like. I might cut out a little bit of the high end,
And you think
just to put it in its own space a little bit.
not settle down
But it sounds so different.
all.
I like what it's doing. So I'm just gonna leave those filters on to make sure there's nothing excessive coming from that. And then we have this one kind of yelling vocal at the end. And I'm actually going to thin this out a little bit. This vocal just needs to be a little bit thinned, and then I also want it to be a little less super bright. So more present, but not bright. Almost telephony. Let's try that in the context. So lower than I would have done in solo, which is why you always need to check in the context of the mix. So this boost around there felt better in the context of everything. Cool. Okay. Dig that for sure. Let's get into these woes. Now for these, they're all more or less doing the same thing. So we're going to put them in a track stack. So I selected all of these tracks. I'm going to hit Command Shift and D. It's going to create a summing stack, which will allow us to process it. And we're just going to title this Chorus Vox. And then now when I solo this, I get all those vocals at once. I might need to do some dynamic containing on individual tracks, but for the most part, this is all the same performance, just sung in kind of different positions. So I just want to overall bring these out in the mix, cut out a little bit of mud. So we'll do a high pass filter here. I actually am not bothered by that on this track. Bringing a little bit of fullness, actually. Not much, but a little bit. And then a little bit of this presence up here. And then a little bit of air in the super high end. Output down to balance the volume a little bit. Cut that just a little bit more. So I end up cutting it in the end. Cool. Sometimes if it's with the different harmonies, I might get in and do more individual work, but I think on this song, just EQing the entire group makes sense. So now that we finished EQing our individual channels, let's give one last listen through and see if there's anything else that we want to tweak before we call the EQ done. I feel like while the guitars feel pretty balanced, I feel like they just need a little more presence in the mix. So instead of going onto individual channels, what I'm going to do is group all these together like we did the vocals. So select them all and hit Command Shift and D. That's going to create a summing stack. And now we'll call this guitars. And I can throw an EQ in here that's going to allow us to process all the electric guitars together. Let's listen to just a little bit of this here. So we can just bring in a little bit more presence. Let's go to this chorus here. Somewhere around here, I feel like maybe a little less of kind of this mid-rangey. Cool. It helps a lot. Okay. I'm feeling really good. I think that last little move really helped those guitars cut through, made the overall mix feel just a little bit more present and lively. So let's now compare back to our static mix where we don't have any EQ on any individual tracks. And notice when I switch over to the static mix, I anticipate what's going to be is a good amount of like nasally mid-range stuff and way less body and low end and fullness. So it's going to feel more kind of like a demo and less like a honed professional song. Check it out. Much cleaner, clearer, fuller. There's less of that harshness to it. And all that is EQ throughout the tracks. Now, to be honest, this is probably one of the less extreme versions of this that I've had in a song. I've had it in some songs where the difference before and after EQ is transformative. But the best case scenario is something more like this where we got the right tones so that when we do EQ, it's not drastically changing anything. It's just subtly cleaning it up a little bit. And again, all these subtle steps are going to add up to a much more professional final product. So trust the process, go through, EQ your individual tracks if you need it on the individual tracks. Try to cut out things that you don't need, minimize the bad, and highlight the good, and you're going to end up with a major, major improvement to your mix. But now that we've finished EQ, it's time to move on to our fourth step, which is compression. Now, with compression, a lot of people make it seem so complicated, but it's not really that complicated of a tool, and what it can do can really shape the dynamics in your mix in a way that's very important and very impactful. So today, we're just going to go through the entire compression process. We're going to put compression on all the individual tracks in our session, and I'm going to walk you through it in real time so you can see exactly how I do it in my mixes. But before we get into it, if you don't already have it, be sure to grab my 6-step checklist to a pro mix. It's completely free from link in the description below, and it just goes through the 6 steps that all professional mixes have and how to do them specifically inside Logic. Okay, let's go and jump into Logic. Now, I know this compressor can look confusing, but don't let it be. There's only a few things you really need to understand to use this compressor. So I like to think of compression as an automatic volume fader. So imagine a fader like on a mixing console or like we have here in Logic, any of these faders. So picture that fader, and then you set a threshold. And anytime sound passes that threshold, it gets turned down. But how quickly it gets turned down really affects the sound. So if you let the sound come through a little bit, then it's going to poke through, cut through, feel a bit punchier, feel a bit livelier in the mix, right? So let it through a little bit. You do that by having a slow attack time, so it lets it through and then it turns it down. Or if you make it a really, really fast attack time, then it's basically going to contain the dynamics a little bit more and shape them. So it might tuck it back in the mix a little bit more, or it might just make it a little bit flatter and fatter so it kind of feels beefier. That's a fast attack time. So you could make it, let it cut through and then get turned down, or where it hits that compressor and basically immediately gets turned down. So fast attack time smashes it down, slow attack time lets it through, makes it pokey. Release time is how quickly it releases back up. So if you have a slow release time, then it's going to turn down anything in between the big hits. If you have a fast release time, then it's going to bring up all the subtleties in between the big hits. So that can help bring out subtleties in your performance or bring out the room sound in a drum track. We'll look at that in a minute. And then your ratio is essentially just how intense it is. So just think of that as how intense it's turning it down. Technically, it's how much it's letting through, but just think of it as kind of an intensity knob. And then your makeup gain, you just dial up to make up any volume lost, because it is compressing the sound, turning it down. So those are the main elements of this compressor. Now we have this on a drum track. We're going to start with this on drums. This is just the drum bus from the producer kit. So the one place that all your drums are running together. So this is our entire drum sound in one place. And I like to start there on my drums just to dial in a little bit of liveliness. So without this compressor, it sounds fine, but it's a little bit dull. It's a little bit flat sounding. So I want to use this compressor to make it a little bit punchier and make it just a little livelier feeling, kind of moving with the drums a little bit more. So I'm going to start by bringing my threshold up so that it's not actually engaging anything. I'm going to have a 3-to-1 ratio, which is kind of just a good general ratio. It's not too intense, but it's enough that it will be noticeable. Sometimes on drums I might go higher, but here we're just going to start with a 3-to-1. And then attack time, I really want to let things cut through, so I'm going to go around 20 milliseconds here. Maybe a little bit slower. You can get a little bit faster with this, but around 15 to 20 milliseconds is a pretty good starting point. And then I think in this case, I'll start with the auto release on, which is fine. But a lot of times with drums, I'll turn it off and I'll dial my release to be more in time with the song. So we'll play around with that and see what we like better in just a minute. I'm going to turn the auto gain off. That's the first thing you should absolutely do. Never use auto gain. It just throws off the perception because it turns it up, and it's not necessarily going to be a 1-to-1, or it's almost never going to be a 1-to-1. So it's going to make it louder in most cases, which might make you think you like the sound of it better, but really it's just turning it up. So auto gain is off. And now let's just dial this in. We'll bring the threshold down until we're getting some compression. If I go down here, it's pretty extreme. So I'm just looking to do a little bit. We're just looking 3 to 5 decibels of compression on my entire drum bus here. So that is feeling pretty good to me. If I turn this off, it's a little bit louder. So let's go ahead and turn the makeup gain up a little bit here. Okay, so notice how the in-between of the hits is starting to come through a little bit more. It's letting that initial hit through, but then it's quickly releasing back up. So it feels livelier with this on. So punchier and livelier. Let's play around with the release here. If I set it to be slower. Bring it to be a little bit faster. There, it's basically just immediately releasing. I think I like the timing of this better in the auto. So auto is totally going to work for us here. Okay, let's go and dial in one of these emulations. These are emulating like real analog pieces of gear. I'll often do Studio FET. I also like this vintage FET. And Opto. Opto, notice you'll have to play around with your settings again, kind of dial them in to get compression. Optos just react differently. But I'm liking either this. I think I like this the best on this drum bus. I'm going to bring the threshold down just a little bit. And then let's go ahead and dial in the distortion. This is just going to add a little bit of saturation from like the analog emulation part of this. And dial back your output because it will turn it up just a little bit. Okay, so this is off. And back on. Right, like how much punchier and livelier do those feel? Let's listen to the context. Okay, zero in on kind of the kick and the snare, the do, cat, and focus how when I engage this, you'll notice those just cut through a little bit more immediately.
Just to get out, yeah, just to get out of the figure. Now you say.
Okay, that's feeling good. Let's go ahead and dive into some of these individual tracks on the drums. I'll often do kick, but I feel like I'm liking the sound of this kick, kind of the shape of it. Sometimes I use it to make the kick cut through a little bit more, make it pokier, but I think this kick is working fine in that regard. Let's.
Just to get out, yeah, just.
I think we could dial it on the snare drum to get it to cut through a little bit more, so I'm going to throw one on the snare top here.
Just to get out, yeah.
And I'm going to use a Studio FET. This is an 1176 style. Go around 3-to-1 on this one as well. Turn auto gain off. Always turn auto gain off. And then let's start with it around 15 milliseconds. That can work on individual snares
Just
as
to
well.
get out, yeah, just to get out of the figure. Now you're saying goodbye, yeah, you're saying
Slow down the release a little bit.
all getting sicker, yeah. Just to get out, yeah, just.
So what I'm watching is for this meter to kind of fall back in time. So like in time with the hits.
Just to get out, yeah, just to get out.
So that's what I'm going for there. And then dial in a little bit of the distortion here.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out. Out of
The gain down just a little bit because that adds some volume.
Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud.
Listen in the context of the mix. When I engage this, that snare just cuts through.
Just to get out, yeah,
So
it's
off.
just to get out. Out of the thick of it. Now you're saying
Yeah, huge. Much, much better. Okay, let's go in this drum room. I love smashing drum rooms with compressors. It's huge. Okay, so drum room here. Let's do that studio FET as well. I'm going to go with a really fast attack time. I really love, this is 1176 style. I really like that style of super fast compression on drum rooms. Really high ratio, so the intensity is crazy. Auto gain off. We'll do a little bit of makeup gain once we get the threshold set. So I have a super high ratio. Let's go even a little bit higher, somewhere around 20 to 1. Really intense. We're getting a lot of compression here. Again, I like the sound of this audio. I feel like the timing of that is pretty good. What I'm wanting here is for it to basically turn down the big hits and then let up and let breathe the sound of the room in between the big hits. So it feels less like any sort of direct mic and more like just the feel of the room that's in between those big hits. So use some makeup gain here. Turn on a little bit of this distortion to get a little saturation. Dial the output back down. Okay, so before... Crazy, right? Let's listen to that in the context of the full drum sound here. Turn that off. I mean, that's starting to feel kind of like a real room, right? Now, I actually think I want to EQ real quick before this. I feel like there's some sub in that. I just want to cut out some of that sub. Okay. Just a little housekeeping thing I should have done before. Okay, so now... off. Now, I will say in the context of the drums, I feel like it's a little bit extreme. So now what I want to do is just dial the mix up. So this is just going to be no compression at all. And as I dial it this way, it's going to be all compression. So somewhere in between here, I can just blend this. So let's listen in the context of the drums. I'm liking that. Off, on, cool, that's awesome. Okay, and then let's do one more thing. Let's do parallel compression. I don't always, well, I would say I almost always do parallel compression.
yeah, you're saying you're proud.
The idea with parallel compression is you have your main drum sound and then you have a super over compressed signal that you're blending up into it. And you can make this a really flat and fat with a fast attack time to blend up and make the drums fatter. Or in this case, I'm going to make it even a little bit punchier by having a slowish attack time to let those initial hits through. So the way we're going to do this is go to the individual drums here. Sometimes I'll do all my toms and everything. I think in this case, no, let's go and do all the toms. No, we'll just do the kick and snare. I think in this case, I just want the kick and snare to cut through a little bit more. And we're just going to go to buses, go down to 11. And we're just going to send that completely. And I am doing in the default setting, which will follow the volumes that are set here. So I'm sending it completely 100%. So I just held option and set all these to 0. And then because it is what's called post pan, it's after the volume set on these faders. So I keep the same relative balance from my kicks and my snare top and snare bottom. And then that creates a new track all the way over here. We're going to just title this P comp. And then I can right click on it and hit create track, which will bump it back over by the drums here. And we'll also see it over by the drums over here, although I want to move it down below the drum bus. There we go. Okay, so this is parallel compression. We're going to go ahead and throw a compressor on here. Listen to this in solo. And what I want to do, I like this bus style compression from this vintage VCA here. Auto gain off. We're going to make it really extreme again. Somewhere around 10 to 1 is kind of my preference for parallel compression. And then attack time around 15 is probably good. And yeah, we'll go with this release time here. And I just want to get it where it's really, really spiky. I'm actually going to speed it up a little bit. And I'm going to slow down this release. So it's kind of turning down everything in between the hits. So this is basically just becoming a super spiky drum sound. All right, so we are around the same volume here. Dial in a little bit of distortion. Turn down the output gain a little bit. Okay, so off, on, and then let's blend this in with the drum signal in the context of the mix here.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the figure. Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. All getting sicker, yeah.
You don't necessarily need a lot of this. So notice when I mute this, how the drums, if you focus in on the kick and the snare, they just get lost a little bit in the mix. They're still cutting through, but they just get lost a little bit in the mix. So this is in, out. It's subtle, but it definitely helps him just cut through a little bit more. And you can blend that up to taste. Some mixes I need it more if it's a really dense mix. In this song, I don't really need a lot of it. Okay, let's just listen really quickly to what we've done with these drums with just these variables. So we kind of listened to parallel compression before and after. Let's just listen to just these drums here and check this out. I'm going to have it on, and then I'll turn it off and notice how the drums just kind of get flat. Check it out. Flat, lifeless. Much livelier, cooler sounding. Off, on. Okay. Yeah. It's subtle, but it really, really makes a difference. So that's drum compression. Let's go ahead and move on to this bass here. But really quick, before we do that, if this video is helpful so far, if you already feel like you're getting value out of this video, could you be sure to like it? That really helps let YouTube know that more people should see this video. That'll be helpful to them as well. So be sure to like it and let me know in the comments, because YouTube loves comments as well. And I love comments, just knowing if you're already hearing a difference in what we're doing. So be sure to like and comment, and let's go ahead and get back into it. So with this bass, we just want to contain all the peaks so that the low end feels really consistent in our mix. So let's go back to this section here. I'm going to throw a compressor on here, and I really like this vintage Opto on bass, or the FET. The FET is pretty aggressive, so we might dial it in and just kind of listen to the two a little bit. So we're going to go a little bit intense here, not too intense because I don't want to really smash it down, but somewhere around 3-1. And then I'm going to make it a much faster setting because I want a little bit of those hits to cut through, but mostly I want to just contain the dynamics of this. And then I think auto is going to work fine for me here. Lower the threshold, so I'm getting less compression. But just notice how on some hits, it's spiking up more, and that's really going to make it much more consistent. It's just going to smooth it out. Turn auto gain off. Down a little bit of makeup gain. It looks like we already did, so I think we're good there. And then I'm going to dial in a little bit of the saturation. So listen to the context.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the figure. Now you say you're proud, yeah, you say I'll get sicker.
So I think I'm actually just wanting to bring this bass up a little bit. Let me do that first. And then I think I need to dial this output gain back down just a little bit more.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the figure.
Yeah. So if you're listening on good headphones, you'll notice as soon as I take off this compression, the low end kind of disappears a little bit. It's just less consistent. Whereas when this compressor is engaged, it's much more consistent. It's much more even.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the figure. Now you
I do want to let a little bit more of those initial hits through. So I'm going to slow the attack time down just a little bit, dial the threshold back down to get around the same amount of compression. Cool. And I don't even think I'm going to mess with this vintage Opto. I think on this bass, I'm liking the sound of the Studio FET. Okay, so I'm digging that. Let's go and look at the guitars. Now with the guitars, sometimes I'll compress on individual channels, but in this case, I actually think I just want to do a little bit of compression on the guitar bus, and it's just going to move them together a little bit. Now, one cool trick is that we can do this with dual mono, which means that it's going to treat the left and ears independently. But if we hit couple here, it will set them together. So we can set them once, but it will listen to them independently. So if the guitar on the right ear just gets a little bit too loud, it will turn that down a little bit more, or it'll let it cut through in a different way. You get the idea. It lets it breathe the left and right more evenly, but it contains them at the same time. So let's go ahead and dial this in where you have it set to couple. We're going to turn auto gain off here. And I really like, again, the 1176 style, and around 10 to 15 milliseconds seems to be a sweet spot for me on electric guitars. So let's listen to this in the context of the mix here. And yeah, we'll keep everything else the same. Really pokey. Okay, this one's subtle, but really focus in on the guitars and notice how they just kind of cut through a little bit more. Those initial hits are like, dad, cat. They just feel livelier.
Just to get out, just to get out of the figure. Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. All getting sicker, yeah. Just to get out, just to get out.
Yeah, I'm definitely liking what that's doing. Okay, so that's our guitars. I'm not going to do anything on any individual tracks here. Let's listen to this piano and see if we think. Sometimes I'll do a slow attack compressor on a piano to help it cut through. Yeah, let's see if we can bring it out just a little bit with a little bit of slow attack compression here. And I'm going to do, I like Opto on this. So I think this has a great sound already. I think it's cutting through. It's doing what we need. So see if you can find this sound in the mix, and notice when I engage this compressor, it's going to cut through a little bit more. So we'll start with it off, and then as soon as I engage this, you should be able to hear it a little bit better. So it's just turning down after that initial hit, so that hit cuts through, and then it gets turned down a little bit, and that's making it punch through and cut through a little bit more in the mix. So when people say overcompressed, I think they're missing the idea that it can be used to shape it in a way that's really cool and isn't necessarily just always containing it, but shaping it so it cuts through in the right way in the mix. Okay, we're not going to do anything on these synths here because they're more textural elements. Let's go ahead and get into vocals, which I'm sure is something a lot of people are like, how do I compress vocals? Okay, so let's listen to this vocal here.
Just to get out, just to get out of the figure.
Now, what you'll notice is like the out of the thick of it, the it is kind of lost in the mix. So what we want to do is clamp down more on the louder words and let those quieter words come through a little bit more. Again, believe it or not, I'm going to use the Studio Fed. I love the sound of this thing. An 1176 style compression is my go-to. Now, a thing to know about 1176 compressors, like real ones, is their slow setting is, I think, 900 microseconds or whatever it is, which is, it's less than 1 millisecond. So it might be 800, 900. So I tend to set these around 1 millisecond as my attack time. I like the slowest attack time on a 1176 compressor. And then I typically keep it around 50 milliseconds, which is the fastest release on a 1176. And on a vocal, I tend to go pretty aggressive, somewhere around 4 to 1. Sometimes I'll go higher, or sometimes I'll just stack compressors and get crazy. But here, we're going to see if we can get this to sound the way we want it to with just the one compressor. So initial thoughts are that that might sound a bit aggressive. I'm dialing in my distortion right off the bat because I want to hear that. But let's listen to this. Now, what you're looking for is that it's just not compressing any on words that it doesn't need to be compressing on. So that was turning it down quite a bit because we hadn't dialed up any makeup gain yet.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. We're all getting sick of it, yeah.
Now, with this vocal and this mix, I feel like it's
Just
maybe
to
making
get
it
out,
a little bit too bitey in the high end. Let's listen to a couple of these other emulations.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud.
Let's just try and turn off the distortion, see if we like the sound of that
Just to
better.
get out, yeah, it's just to get out.
Yeah, I think there's something in the distortion that just isn't working on this particular vocal. So always trust your ears. Even if you know you've liked the way this has worked on something else, sometimes you just have to switch it up, which is what's happening to me right now.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out
But check out,
of the thick of it.
it's kind of crazy. Okay, let's listen to it before and after, and we're just going to do the same phrase here. And notice specifically the last word, thick of it, the it, how that just gets lost when this compressor isn't on, and how just generally this vocal is cutting through more with this compressor on. So we're just going to do the first phrase twice. This is without compression.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it.
And with compression.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. Now you're saying
I mean, it's cutting through way, way more. And it's not any louder at any given point. It's just more contained. So the loudest point is actually turned down a little bit, and that quieter stuff is getting brought up because we have that fast release time. Okay, so happy with this on the lead vocal. We're going to use this as the starting point for the double, but I might actually speed up the attack time even a little bit more so that it's really, really clamping down on the double.
just to get out, yeah, it's just to
Let's
get
look at the
out.
setting here.
Get out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're
Got a little
proud.
bit of tuning there for sure.
All
Dial this
getting
threshold down
sick
just a
of
little
it,
bit.
yeah.
Cool. And then let's listen to this with the lead vocal here.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out.
I'm actually going to leave the attack time where it is.
out
Let's go
of
ahead and
the-
copy this to the left and right double. And check those. Just make sure they're kind of getting the right amount of compression on each of them. So this is the left here.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get
Bring the
out.
threshold down here.
Get out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud.
So funny. In context, I'm not noticing in that tuning, but in the solo, you're like, oh, I can hear a little bit of tuning on that vocal. But in the context, it's not noticeable at all, in my opinion.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out.
Okay, so now that those are set up, let's listen to these vocals. I'll go ahead and listen to all four of them with it off, and then I'll engage it for all four of these vocals here. So this is off,
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out.
and then on.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. All getting sick of it, yeah.
So much more even, nothing's really getting lost in the mix, and they just feel a little bit fuller, right? Okay, definitely digging that. There's these other vocals here. For the sake of time, I'm not going to dial them in just because I would do it exactly the same way and I want to be respectful of your time. But let's look at these back-end vocals because I would do these a little bit differently. So these back-end vocals are just woes.
Oh,
And really, all I really need to do here is contain the biggest peak. So we're going to do a dual mono again because I want it to treat the left and right differently. If it needs to compress a little bit more on one side or the other, I want it to do that. We're going to hit couple here. And then I tend to really like this vintage opto on vocals. We'll see if that works for us today. Turn auto gain off. And we'll have a fairly fast attack time here. It doesn't need to be super fast, but I do want to contain the biggest peaks. And then a 2-to-1 ratio is probably good. Might scale it up closer to 3-to-1 though. Okay, there we go. So what you're seeing here is that it's turning down the louder words more, not turning down the quieter words as much. So they're benefiting from that makeup gain, making the quieter words louder. So it's more even and consistent. So Okay, so let's finish out, because now we've hit every single track here that needs it, except for a couple of those backing vocals, but more or less every single track here. Let's finish out by listening to this static mix here compared to after EQ and compression. Check it out.
Just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. Now you're saying,
I mean, that's crazy.
yeah, you're saying you're proud. All getting sick of it,
So much more balanced, so much livelier, right? The difference just between static mix, adding in EQ on individual tracks that need it, compression on individual tracks that need it, we're getting more fullness, more punch, more clarity. There's kind of a weird honkiness when I go back to that static mix. Just listen to this.
just to get out, yeah, it's just to get
Kind of honky,
out of the thick of it.
much clearer.
Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. All getting sick of it, yeah.
Drums feel way less flat, they're punchier, they're livelier. It just has completely enhanced the mix, and we haven't even done any effects. There's no reverb, no delay, nothing like that creating space in this mix. All we have is the tracks that have been set, level set. We've done EQ and compression on the master track, EQ on individual tracks, and compression on individual tracks that need it, and that's a difference that we've already made. So if you don't already have my 6-step checklist to a Pro Mix, be sure to pick it up. It's going to go through all the steps we've done and the next few steps that we haven't even gotten into yet, and you can reference it anytime that you're working on a mix in the future. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Is that change pretty noticeable to you? Let me know in the comments below. If this video was helpful and you think it would be helpful to other people, be sure to like it, because that really helps make a difference, and be sure to leave a comment and subscribe so that YouTube just knows that this video is actually helpful and should be in front of more people. But let's go ahead and move on to the 5th mix step, which is effects like reverb and delay. Now, it's important to know up top that reverb might be killing your mix. The reality is that putting reverb on too early in the mixing process clouds our judgment, because it just fills in all these spaces that we need to be paying attention to. So by holding off on putting on reverb and delays and other effects like that until after we've gotten all of our levels set, all of our EQ and compression dialed in, then we can make better decisions. Up until that point, we can know that we're starting with a solid foundation, then just use reverb and other effects to enhance that mix. This can be a little intimidating because reverb helps make things feel a little more polished, a little bit more finalized, but if you do it too early, it's going to hold you back in the long run, I promise. So, okay, let's go and jump into Logic and take a look at our song and figure out what we want to dial in wave effects. So let's just listen to it a little bit here, and I'm going to tell you what I'm listening for and what I think this mix calls for, but try to note it yourself and see what you think you would do in this mix as well.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. All getting sick of it, yeah.
So to me, the main things that I think I want is a little more extension in the drums, a little bit more depth to them, make them feel like they're in a bigger space. That would be first. The second would be to put the guitars into kind of a realistic feeling room, something small. I don't want to cloud up these guitars, but I want to create a little bit of space around them. The third would be just a little bit of space around the vocal to make it feel a little bit more epic and make it take up a little bit more space in the mix. So let's jump in and start with these drums here. And the first way I like to do this is actually just triggered from the snare top. We're going to send off from here, go to a new bus. So we'll just go to bus 1. And we're using buses because they allow us to send over to that effect, so we can send multiple tracks over to that effect. We're not using that here, but we'll use it in just a minute. So we can send multiple tracks to one reverb, for example, and then we can also process that additionally. So if we want to put distortion or compression or EQ that effect, we can do that on that channel. And it protects the static mix, because this channel, our original channel, the level isn't affected at all as it might be if you put a reverb or an effect directly on it. So it keeps your static mix as it is, and then we can just blend in effects with it. So let's go ahead and find that bus. In this view, we can find that track over here. We can hit create track, and that will pop it over by our snare. I can title this snare verb. And then on here, what I want to do is just add a reverb. So we're just going to go down to reverb. Let's do Space Designer here. And here I'm just looking for something fairly short. So something like a short snare room. I know that there's a couple of those built in here, so we're going to go to small spaces, rooms. Let's see, something around 3.3 seconds is good. Yeah, they have a 0.4 snare chamber. They have a wide and small. Let's try the snare chamber first and just see if we like the sound of that. So we're going to listen to the drums here. And I'm going to send from this snare just a full signal. If I take this send off. So this is off. Put it back on. This is what that sounds like here. Just the reverb. It's actually not a bad snare sound. If I mute it here, it immediately just kind of gets a little bit wider and a little bit darker sounding. This is kind of a dark to mid-rangey snare sound or reverb sound. So I like that. Let's actually just try one other though in the context of the drums. Let's try that 0.3 room that we were looking at earlier. Let's try, yeah, this wooden chamber here. In solo. This one's a little bit brighter. I don't know if I like it quite as much. Let's go to one more. I like this wide and small. I know I've used that in other mixes. Wide and small. Let's listen to this one with the drums. I think I might like that snare chamber best. So let's go back to that snare chamber. Again, take it away. It just extends that snare just a little bit, helps it take up a little bit more space, and in the context of the mix.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names.
Now, when I'm dialing in my effects, what I like to do is bring them all the way down and then just mix them up until I hear them just a little bit, and then I'll scale it back just a little bit.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away. You say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just.
I have a pretty healthy mix of this, but I think it kind of just blends in with the drum sound, so I'm okay with that. Okay, the next thing I want to do is a little trick from CLA, from Chris Lord Alge. That's just a really cool trick. We're going to send reverb from all of our non-direct sources, so from our overheads, our snare bottom, and from our room track here. So I'm going to go down here to this bottom bus and send from there. We'll just go to bus 2. I'm going to send a full signal from each of these, but we could tailor it later. We'll go over here to find that bus. I'm going to go ahead and title this drum verb. And this is going to give us just a general drum reverb sound. We'll hit create track, so it moves it over to here. And then I'm actually going to pull it to be down outside of this stack. And then on this, we're just going to go, I'm going to use the Space Designer again. And I want to find a room that's somewhere around 1 full second, 1 to 2 seconds. So we're going to go medium spaces here. And let's try this nice room to start and just see if we like the sound of that. So go up to the drums, we'll solo those. Take it away. Initially, I like the sound of it all off the bat. Let's try one other preset just for the sake of it here. Let's try percussion room. It's starting to feel a little bit long to me for this mix. Let's try something a little bit shorter. That's pretty cool. But I think I like that last one just a little bit better. So let's go back to that. It was the nice room, 1.4 seconds here. Yeah. Take that all the way out. And we'll mix it back up in the context of the full song.
Say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out. Out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you say. Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying
they had a
that you're
lot more
stable.
depth and dimension of those drums. So let's go ahead and I'll just grab both of these here and I'll mute them. And notice how when they're muted, the drums just feel smaller, like they're not in as big and realistic of a space. There's not much depth to them.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable,
solo just the drums to hear this together. Yeah, I think it adds a nice level of depth, but it's not getting in the way of it feeling really upfront present. And that's a trick by triggering this just from the overhead, snare bottom, and room. You're not going to create basically a more distant sound with your direct sources. Again, if you haven't seen my Make Logic Drum Sound Reel series, I'll link to it above here. That's one of the tricks that we use in that. Okay, so that's going to be our drum sound. Let's go ahead and go down to these guitars here. And I just want to put all of these guitars into one space that feels realistic. So I'm going to go to sends from the guitar bus. I've selected this entire track stack here, and I'm sending from this track stack. We're going to go down to bus 5. And again, that's going to create a new bus over here for us. We're going to call this guitar room. And here, I want a fairly small room, something a second or less most likely, but we'll listen to it in the context. I also will often end up using spring reverbs for this. I just like the way spring reverbs sound on guitars. So we'll go over here to guitar. We'll go and create track. That's going to put it over here next to the guitars here. And then on this, we're again just going to go down to Space Designer. And I'm going to show you a little trick. Before the Space Designer, I want to go down to Imaging and pull up the Direction Mixer. And I just want to flip this to be 180 degrees, which is going to flip the left and the right, so that if you hear the guitar amp on the left side, you're hearing the room reverb on the other side. So it's like you hear the amp on one side, and then you hear it bouncing off the wall on the other side. I'll show you that in just a second. So now that we have that set up, let's go and pick some room here. Again, let's start with a small space. And there's several in here that I've used. I kind of like this recording stage and this realistic room. I think are both really nice for this purpose. Let's start with the realistic room. And let's just dial it up. We'll go back to our guitars here. And we're just going to send 100%. If I mute that. Instead of lying that you're stable. What I'm going to do here is just blend this back up in now. You say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. Back to the start of that. Instead of crying at the table. Take that away. Instead of giving other names. Listen to this in solo. If I just solo one of these guitars here, you hear the guitar in the left ear, and then you hear the reverb in the right ear because I flipped it with that direction mixer before the reverb. I actually think I really like the sound of this, so I think that's a good starting point. Instead of crying at the table. I might tweak it a little bit more, but for sake of time, I think that's a good starting point for us with the reverb here on this guitar. Now, real quick, if you're liking this video so far and you think it would be helpful to someone else, could you be sure to like the video so that YouTube knows to show it to other people? It makes a big difference. Okay, let's go and get back into it. So let's go and get into, you know what? I'm going to send these keys to it too. I think that might be helpful. So we're going to go ahead and just hit Command-Shift and D to put all these into a summing stack. And we're going to send these, we're going to call these keys. We're going to send all of these also to that same guitar room, but a lesser mix. I don't want as much of it on there. So instead of sending full, I'm holding Option to just send all of it. I'm just going to dial it up while listening to it in the context of the mix. Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving other names, instead of lying that you yeah, that's helping add just a little bit more depth and dimension to those digital elements that I think are really nice. And I ended up with nearly a full send. Again, if I mute that guitar room, It's a subtle change, but it's just a little bit more of a 3D element that goes away. Again, you don't want these to be transformative. You kind of want them to be tucked, at least in my opinion. Best effects are felt, not heard. You don't want them to be too extreme, but you get them up to where you're hearing them, dial them back a little bit, and you're likely living in a really good area. Okay, so let's go and focus now on this lead vocal. We're going to use a couple of effects on here because we really want this to be the center point of the song. So the first thing I do on more or less all my vocals is a stereo slapback delay that's kind of muffled. That's going to add a lot of fullness and warmth here. So we're just going to do a full send. We're going to call this stereo slapback. And I'm going to come on here and do a stereo delay. And I've created a preset because I end up using more or less these same settings every time. I'll turn off tempo sync, and I end up having something like 52 milliseconds and 57 milliseconds. So this is a really, really fast slapback delay. And then I've done a low cut to 410 and cut all the way down to 3700. So I'm cutting out all the highs and the lows from this. So it's a really mid-range focus on both the left and the right side. Slightly different on the left and the right side, just for a little bit of difference here. And then we have no feedback, no cross right to left, and then 100% mix. So if we listen to this in solo here,
Instead of crying at the table,
it just sounds like a slightly wide
instead
vocal.
of giving all the names.
And then what we can do is mix that in with the lead vocal, and we're going to get a nice wide feeling lead vocal sound.
Instead of crying at the table,
Take that back. We're just going to blend it up till we hear it and then dial it back.
Instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, and you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. And now you're saying,
So notice when I mute this that the vocal just feels a little bit thinner, a little bit lonely. And as soon as I unmute it, that the vocal feels a little bit wider and a little bit fuller, even though it's not really an obvious effect.
instead of crying at the table, instead of giving all the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away.
Yeah, so that's definitely helping a lot. Okay, we're going to send another effect here for the vocal. We're going to send this to bus 13. And then we're going to call this a slapback delay. This is just going to be a mono slapback delay. So we're going to go down to tape delay. It's in stereo right now. If I flip this here to the mono signal, then it will automatically put it to mono. That just means that it's only going to be in the center. And we're going to call this slap. And then I want this one to be a fair amount brighter. We're going to turn off the tempo sync. And we're just going to make it somewhere around 70 to 120-ish milliseconds, somewhere in that range. We'll listen to it with the vocal to find the exact timing. And I'll turn the wet up just a little bit higher to around 50. We're going to start with it being full brightness, but I might scale that back in a second. So we have the vocal here.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving all the names,
Reduce the feedback just a little bit.
instead of
So many
lying
times
that
it
you're
repeats.
stable, instead of pushing it away.
Speed up just a
You
little
say
bit.
it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. All getting sick of it.
Thinning it out, making it a little less full in the low, mid, low end range.
Instead of crying at the table,
And then again, we're just going to bring this all the way down and mix it back up.
instead of crying at the table, instead of giving all the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away. And you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're proud.
And then I'm actually going to distort it a little bit. So we're going to go in here to distortion. And I think just this regular distortion will work for me. Let's listen to this in solo.
Instead of crying at the table,
Yeah, I kind of like that right off the bat.
instead of giving all the names,
Maybe bring the tone up just a little bit.
instead of lying that you're stable,
That's just cutting out, or cutting less of
instead
the high
pushing it
end.
away. And you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're
And I'm
proud,
gonna cut a
yeah,
little
you're
bit more in the low
saying
end.
you're proud. We're all getting sick of it, yeah. Instead of crying at the table,
Cool. in the context here.
Instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away.
Let's get it back just a
You
little
say
bit.
it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick. Instead of crying at the table,
Cool.
instead of giving out the names,
If I take away both those sins,
instead of crying at the table,
add them back in.
instead of giving out the names.
Just creating a little bit of space around the vocal. So I'm not even using reverb yet on this vocal. I do think I will send to a reverb. I think I'd like a little bit of kind of a medium to long, probably plate reverb. Let's go ahead and try that. Title this plate. And we'll send a full amount here. We'll start with the space designer. And I'm going to go down to medium spaces, plate reverbs. And let's try the soft plate to start.
Instead of crying at the table,
Way too bright for me. Let's try drum plate. You never know.
instead of crying at the table,
That's kind of neat
instead
sounding.
of giving out the names,
I like the sound of that.
instead of lying that you're stable, instead
Let's
of pushing
try
it away.
a slightly longer one
You
because
say it's
there's a
just
fair
to
amount of
get out.
space after the phrases that we have to play with for this to fill in those gaps. So let's try a large space. And let's try this 2.6 vocal plate.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names,
I don't dislike it. Let's try the
instead of
next
lying
one.
that you're stable, instead of pushing it away. And you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out.
Cool. Okay. I'm digging that, I think. I like the length of that, but I want to cut a little bit of the high end. So I'm going to put an EQ before this, just the channel EQ. And we're just going to cut a little bit of the high end.
Instead of crying at the table,
And then just a
instead
little
of
bit of
giving
the
out
low
the
end.
names,
So it doesn't get kind of muddy down there.
instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away. And you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out. Get out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud.
Cool. Okay. I'm liking that. It's giving us a nice length. Let's listen in the context of the mix, though, and see what we think of it.
Instead of crying at the table,
Obviously too
instead of
loud.
giving out the names,
Okay, let's try blending it up in now.
instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away. And you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it.
One more time from the top.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying.
I think I want to get crazy here. I think I actually want to throw a delay before this, and I want to have a quarter note delay that's running into this. So let's actually go and do that. Let's go down to delay. We'll just do a stereo delay here. But we're just going to set it to quarter note and then quarter note on the right side as well. And we'll just set a very, very slight offset so that it has a little bit of stereo width to it. And then cut out the high end here on this. And we're going to set this left and right mix to be lower because I want to have the original vocal cut through hit that reverb and then the delay hit the reverb.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing
try
it away.
Maybe
You
a
say
quarter
it's just
note or
to
a
get
half
out,
note.
yeah, it's just to get out. Get out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. We're all getting sick of it, yeah. Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away. And you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out.
And then let's dial the dry in a little bit on this reverb.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names,
So let's actually make this delay 100%, I think.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, and you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. We're all getting sick of it, yeah.
Cool, okay. Took me a second, but I finally got the vision. I needed to reduce the amount of reverb wet mix to get it to sound the way I wanted to with a fairly dry delay. And then...
instead of crying at the table,
then the reverb
instead of
really
giving out the
kicking in.
names,
So then it's really just going to fill in those
instead of lying that
spaces.
you're stable, instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable.
And I think I might actually switch this stereo delay to be 8th note in the left ear.
Instead of crying at the table,
And then it kind of has a bit of a
instead of
ping pong
giving out the
thing.
names,
I'll set the deviation to 0.
instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, and you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the thick of it.
Cool. Okay. I'm definitely digging that. I'm going to bring it down just a little bit. And then I'm going to keep these initial like double and backing vocals totally
Get
dry.
out. You say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out.
And then the last thing we have is our big chorus vocals that come in right here. And I want these to hit a very prominent time delay and then a even longer plate reverb, I believe. So we're going to go ahead and send off to 2 new sends for these, just from the entire chorus vox bus. And we'll title this Timed Delay. And we'll make this, again, just a stereo delay here. Go back to the start of that. I think just 8th note. Cut a little bit of the high end out. And we'll blend it up in here. Cool. Dig it. I'm going to dial up the feedback just a little bit. Cool. It's short, but it's helping fill in some of the space, give these vocals a little bit more of a tucked in feel as opposed to sitting on top of the mix. And then we're going to create one more send, and this is going to be a super long plate reverb here. Actually, I might go with a room reverb just so it's a little less bright. So we'll say long room. Be sure to title your effects so you know what you're sending to. And it makes it easy then too. I can just, under my buses, see exactly which ones I'm sending off to. So we'll go here. I'm going to do Space Designer yet again. And we're just going to pull up a large space under halls. Let's try Smooth Vocal Hard to start. I don't know if that'll be long enough for me though. I'm digging it, so that's a good option, but let's see. I was thinking something more around 4 seconds. I feel like that one's getting a little bit too long here. Let's try Warm Hall. That's starting to feel better to me. Let's go ahead and try to blend it in and see if we like it or if we need to do any EQ work on it. Cool. I'm digging it. Let's listen to this one more time. Just listening to that tail there. Yeah, I think I like the tone of that on those vocals. Okay, so let's take a second here. We're going to start back in this verse, and I want to just compare with level set appropriately, which we've done in the static mix. Then we did master track processing, then EQ and compression, and now just reverb and delay, and compare that back to our static mix, which basically is just our level set, and then it's also hitting the master track processing. So EQ, compression, and effects is what we're going to be hearing the difference of. And notice how it changes the mix. I haven't done this comparison yet, so let's see how it changes it.
Instead of crying at the table, instead of giving out the names, instead of lying that you're stable, instead of pushing it away, and you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out,
Yeah.
out of the thick of it.
Clearer,
Now
a
you're
little bit more
saying
three-dimensional
you're
depth.
proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud,
Yeah.
all getting sick of it, yeah. Settle down at all, yeah. 'Cause you're young and you think that you might not settle down at all, yeah.
Cool.
'Cause baby, we're not on call. Baby, we're not on.
It's coming together. Definitely needs a little bit of tweaking still, but it kind of is like going from a demo to a finished product. It's much more clear. It's less covered up. It has less harsh and nasally frequency. And then the effects have given us this realistic depth to the mix that we just weren't getting before. So not a perfect mix yet. We'll continue to tweak it, but it's definitely much, much closer than that static mix, which again, when we set the static mix, already felt like a decent mix. If you can get a good static mix, then you're just building on top of that and making sure that you like the decisions that you're making as you go. Okay, now it's finally time for the sixth and final step of the mixing process, automation. Now, if you've been mixing for any amount of time, then you might be using automation too early. Automation is a really powerful tool, but if you apply it too early, it could actually hold back your mix. I've helped thousands of people improve their mixing over the last few years, and one of the biggest mistakes I see is that they do way too much volume automation in particular, way too early in the process. You want to hold off on automation till the very final step in the mixing process and think of it more as a fine-tuning and perfecting tool. It can, of course, be used for creative things as well, and you can do that a little bit earlier if you need to. But when it comes to majority of automation moves, I wait until the sixth and final step of the mixing process to actually start applying automation. And I think that really helps me because throughout the entire mixing process, I can kind of fine-tune my volumes. I can keep making sure that everything sounds as good as possible. But if I do it too early, then it's just going to keep reverting back to whatever automation I did too early. So hold off on automation. Now we're finally in the sixth step in the mixing process. We're going to start applying it to the mix that we've been doing together. Now, there's a billion things you can automate. It's basically limitless. So the three that I typically encourage people to focus on are your vocal volume. You can call this vocal riding. This is where throughout the entire song, we're going to ride the vocal. And if it's a little bit quiet on a phrase, we'll turn it up. If it's a little bit loud, we'll turn it down. That way the vocal's always sitting exactly right in the mix. It's the most important thing. So a little bit of dedicated time and attention to this is really, really helpful. I'd also, throughout that, I think just vocal or volume automation throughout the mix is important. So if that guitar is a little bit loud in the intro where there's less going on, but then quiet in the chorus, you might need to balance those two volumes a little bit. We've set our static volumes, which is the best general volume level, but you might want to just make sure that there's nothing that's too loud, too quiet throughout the mix. And you can also volume automate just for fun. We might do that a little bit later in this video. The second is pan knob. So panning things a little bit wider, a little bit narrower in the different sections to give it a little bit more width or to have movement. Sometimes you can have things moving around. Don't get too heavy-handed with this. This can be really distracting to the listener, and you don't want your mix to feel distracting. You want to serve the song. So if it's subtle, then it can feel really good, or if it's really obvious for a really particular cool moment, then that's good, but you don't want to do too much of that panning automation. And the third is effects. Now, in most songs, I'm automating effects up and down in choruses. So in the verses, I might bring the effects down so the vocals feel a bit drier, and then the choruses, I'll bring them up a little bit more since there's typically more going on and they feel a little bit bigger and lusher. In this song, because I have a vocal that's for the verses and the bridge, and then a separate vocal stack that's for the choruses, it's kind of a woe chorus song, I'm not going to do that in this song because it just doesn't need it. They're two totally different parts. So I'm not going to be automating effects in that way, but we're going to automate effects in a different way that's really cool that I bet you haven't thought about, or maybe you haven't thought about, that I think you'll enjoy. So stick around for that. That's going to be the last thing we do. Let's go ahead and start with vocal writing, vocal automation. Now, there's two main ways to do automation. The first, if you hit A on the keyboard to bring up your automation here, is just to draw it in. So I could just click here, and then just kind of draw in the different points that I need. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a little bit time consuming, but it can definitely work. I've done it for many songs. If you're coming from GarageBand, that was the only way to do it in GarageBand. But in Logic, we open up the ability to draw it in or write it in. Now we could do this by setting read over here down to latch. And now anything that I do as this plays is going to be written onto that track. You can do that right here inside Logic, which can be nice. It's definitely handy, much faster than drawing in every little point, especially for something like vocal writing. Or you can get something like this fader port 16 that I have, or just a single fader port, or any other DAW controller, the X-Touch from Behringer, anything like that, and you can just draw it in. So with this, I can do the same thing, but I can draw it with this actual fader, which allows me to really fine-tune it, and it gives me kind of an in-person feel with it, more hands-on feel with it. That's just nice. It's a little more fun, right? So you definitely don't need something like this, but it can be really helpful. And by the way, if you want to pick up something like this, if you don't already have it, I'll link to this down below in my Sweetwater link. If you use that link, whether it's to get this fader port, a different touch controller, or really anything, a guitar, a case, anything like that, a small part of it comes back to help support this channel. So any Sweetwater link on any of my videos, if you use them, will come back and support this channel. So grab a fader port or whatever it is you need. It won't cost you any extra, and it will help me continue to put out these videos for free. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into vocal writing. The first step of any sort of automation, and really anything in mixing, is to listen and determine if it needs it at all, and then if it needs it, what it needs. So let's go and listen and think about what you think this vocal needs, if it needs anything. So overall, it's at the right level, right? I think it gets a little bit too loud on kind of that loudest section at the end there, but I really think that first phrase just gets a little bit buried as things are fading out. Just kind of lost, right? So I definitely want to bring that up. And then the second thing I want to do is bring up the tails of the phrases, kind of right after the phrase. There's cool things that happen with the voice, and by automating those up, it makes the vocal feel like it's right in front of the listener. So check it out. I'm going to do it on this fader port, but again, you could just draw it in right here with this fader. Let's go ahead and do it. Catch that think one more time. Might was okay. We're going to catch the start of that phrase. That might's a little loud. One more time. And I actually want to turn that down just a little bit more there. Not settle down at all. Yeah. Cool. So catching kind of the breathiness at the end of that phrase. It's cool, right? It sounds maybe a little weird in solo, but in the context of the song, you just feel that breath a little bit more. Okay, so that's vocal writing. After you do this, always be sure to turn off touch, turn it back to read. Otherwise, it's going to record everything you do on that track as you're going throughout and doing things. So if I come up here and I open this EQ and I just want to tweak this setting while I'm listening to the song, it's going to follow all the moves that I make with that, which is cool and can be a cool effect, but probably not what you're wanting to do when you're just trying to tweak it. Save you a lot of headache. So be sure to turn that off. Okay, we're going to play around with the pan automation just a little bit here. So I'm going to open these guitars and we're just going to draw this in. What I want to do is basically, as it's doing this build, I want to pan these left and right guitars in just a little bit. So we're going to go down to pan, which is under main. And we're going to do absolute, which just means that it's the absolute pan position as opposed to the relative. I find relative confusing to work in. I'm going to do that on this right guitar as well. And I just want to set it, basically right now, it's at the extremes, far left, far right. We're just going to bring it, so I'm using the marquee tool, selecting this entire area, and I'm just going to bring it so that in this, it's somewhere kind of around like halfway panned-ish. And we will shift this so it kind of fades into the center there, and then do the same thing over on this ear. And bring this so it's about halfway, so about 42 on this one as well. And then what I want to do, let's just listen to that real quick.
And you think that
And then as it's going to this build, I want to get a little bit wider throughout that build. So it's just going to give us this feeling like it's getting bigger, 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 bigger through that section. So we're going to play with that for 1 second here. Get it so that, let's see, where's the downbeat? Probably right here. So all the way left, right at this point right here, the start of that measure. And then check this out. We might even bring it in just a little bit more. Let's go in all the way to like 38. Something like that. It doesn't have to be super precise. No one's ever going to see these numbers. Keep that in mind. So it's going to start a little bit narrow, and then it's going to pan out wide, right?
'cause you're young and you think that you might not settle down at all. Yeah. 'Cause baby, we're not
Subtle, but it just gives you that little bit of a shift, right? It makes a mix feel more dynamic. Okay, the last thing I want to do with these guitars is also just, I'm going to take all 4 of these guitars and I just want to pan them up for that same area where it's going da 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 da, just exaggerate that build a little bit, right? So we're going to come on here and I've selected them, which now my fader port means I can see really clearly. It's these 4 tracks. I'm going to go back just a little bit. I need to switch these over to latch. And actually, we'll go to touch. Touch means that while I'm doing the automation, it's going to follow it. And as soon as I stop, it's going to go back to the original point. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and just bring these up a little bit. Cool. Might be a little bit exaggerated. We'll do that one more time and just bring, not quite as extreme. Cool. I dig that. So it starts to make it feel a little bit more extreme. I'm going to do the same thing actually on this kick and snare. Let's go ahead and move this snare verb track down. And we're just going to grab this kick and snare. So this is back to kind of volume automation, but again, we're thinking in those terms of what will make this more interesting for the listener, right? So it's the end of this build, really, that I want to start pulling it up just a little bit. Oh, before I do that, what am I going to do? I'm going to go back to these guitars. You see how easy it is to forget this. Switch this back to read so I don't accidentally write any automation on them later. Okay, select this kick through snare bottom. Set this. We'll go in also to touch, not latch. That way it will fall back to the original position as soon as I'm done automating it. And these 4 tracks here. Cool. That felt good. And then I'm going to, let's see, it's kind of holding over just a little bit on that first hit. I think I want to stop it to where, so that it's really more or less all the way back down when it gets to that first hit there. Cool. So you can tweak it in these parameters. Okay, the second thing I want to do is as soon as I get into this section of the bridge, as soon as these drums come in, I want to bring up the drum room. So this is a different version of varying the effects throughout the song. As I said, a lot of times I'm doing it on the vocals since that's the main thing that's getting really prominent effects. But in this case, I want to do it on the room. So I'm going to turn this back to read on these tracks. I'm going to go down to this room track here. First thing I want to do is just turn it up generally throughout this whole area. So I'm going to find where this section ends. It's probably right around here. Okay, so this measure right here, and I'm just going to find the start of it is around 65, so right before that, we're just going to select this whole area, and we're just going to crank this up just a little bit. So it's about -7. Let's listen to it, see how loud we want it to get. Okay, so if we just listen to that, I'll bring it back down on this fader port here so you can hear it. For this build in particular, with it back at its original level, something like this. It's very kind of close and intimate with it turned up. Right? Makes those drums feel much bigger, like they're taking up more space, and it kind of, again, it just adds to the dynamics of the song. And then I also want to automate it up on each of those individual hits. So I'm just going to go into touch here, and then each time it does, I'm just going to push it up on this fader port. But again, you could do that right here with this fader in Logic. Let's go from the start of it.
'Cause you're young and you think that you might not settle down at all. Yeah. 'Cause baby, we're not on call. Baby, we're not on call. Baby, we're not on call.
And then I want this to fade back here as the rest hits this chorus, so it's not as big and huge as these other things come in, but I want to have it higher than it was before. So it's around -7. I think something probably around here is going to feel better. So otherwise, it's going to be a really intense transition, and I could fade that down more if you wanted to get it all the way back, but I kind of like the idea of these drums feeling bigger in this last chorus. Go ahead and shift that so it really is down by that first hit of the chorus. Cool. Okay, so a little bit different than traditional effect automation, but we did the vocal writing, we did a little bit of pan automation to make things feel bigger, we did a little additional volume automation, and then we also wrote the effects on this drum kit to bring it up and make it feel bigger at different points in our mix. Again, we're just making the mix feel dynamic and helping polish it so it feels more finalized. Okay, so that's automation. Now, real quick, as you finish automation, you're going to want to start taking your mix out to your car, listening to it on your Bluetooth speaker and your AirPods, somewhere outside of Logic, right? You're going to want to listen to it elsewhere. So you're going to want to turn it up. And the way that you want to do that is not with the built-in mastering tool, because that's going to do other things to the mix as well. It has EQ curves. It has maybe a little stereo widening, things that you might not like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't like things in your mix. It's things you don't like about the mastering. So what you want to do instead is set a limiter on your master track. So we're going to go down here to Dynamics, Adaptive Limiter, also called your stereo output. The idea here is that we're just going to turn up, we're going to set a brick wall at the top here. That means that it can't go past and get into digital peaking. If you go past 0, you start to get digital peaking. It's going to protect from that, but we're going to turn the song up into it. Now, typically speaking, if your song is balanced, just getting 3 or 4 decibels of gain reduction on your limiter is going to get you in the ballpark of a decent level. It's still probably going to be quieter, but it's going to be close enough to compare on a Bluetooth speaker and AirPods, whatever. So you want to set your output ceiling here to -0.3. That's going to protect from any sort of additional peaks barely spiking through. I'm going to turn on true peak detection here, and then just in the loudest section of your song, so for me it probably is in this area going into this last chorus, we just want to be bringing up the gain until we're getting 3 to 5 decibels of gain reduction, but use your ears to make sure that you're not getting too much weirdness with that. Sometimes it can start to have a pump in it. So that's looking good to me on this reduction. I'm seeing about 3 decibels. And then you could just use your cycle region here to set it for the entire length of the song. Make sure that it's not going on forever and that it starts at the right moment. In this case, I probably need to shift it around a little bit. And then we'd go down to bounce. And then we can just set this as a wave, the PCM. You can do a wave, which is going to be full resolution. Sometimes for just these quick mix notes, it's okay to do an MP3. I know some people are going to argue with me on that, but it's fine. It's easier to send back and forth to yourself. If you're listening to broad scale EQ, it's likely not going to be the compression that happens turning it into an MP3 that's going to affect your listening. But it doesn't hurt to do a wave. So the PCM, you can do a wave, and then you would just export it out, save it, find it. I text it to my phone, so I send it from messages on my laptop to my phone, and then I can just listen to it on my phone, in my car, Bluetooth speaker, wherever, AirPods. all that good stuff. Okay, so that's the last thing. Then you're going to go through some mix revisions, and then we're going to come back and we're going to master it. Now, before we actually do any mastering, we need to move on to part 8, which is where we create a dedicated mastering session. Just setting up a dedicated mastering session will likely improve your final master. And this is for 2 reasons. First and foremost is because it forces us to think of mixing and mastering as 2 different processes. And that's important because they are. When we're mixing, we're focusing on everything going on in the track. When we're mastering, we're focusing on just that final stereo file and making sure that it's going to hold up against other commercial releases. And if you're working in a project of multiple songs, making sure that they'll all sit well together within that project. And then 2, a dedicated mastering session allows us to do a few things that lets us really focus in on the mastering process. We'll look at that a little bit later in this video, but for example, we can lay out all of our songs that we're going to have on a project together and listen to how they'll flow together and make sure that all those transitions are going to be smooth. We can also compare our mastered version up against our unmastered version and make sure that there's nothing we're losing in the master, so our master is actually sounding better and not just sounding different or louder or more processed or whatever you might be hearing if you try to do it inside your mixing session. So in this video, we're going to walk through the entire process from exporting out your song to create a mastering session, and then how to set up a mastering session to have all these different components easily and in just a few minutes. Okay, let's jump into Logic. So our first step is to export out our song from our mixing session. So the first thing you need to do is set your cycle region to be at the actual start and the actual end of the song. So if we go to the beginning here, I just made sure that I had everything. Basically, the way I like to do is just find just a little bit before the first hit. So for me, it's just a little bit before bar 2. Just enough so that we make sure we're not cutting anything off. And then at the end, you just want to listen through and make sure that everything has enough time to ring out. And you also might want to consider using your master track here to automate down a fade out, just to make sure that everything fully has faded out by the end. If you aren't seeing your master track, it's just Command Shift and M on the keyboard will hide or show the master track. So be sure to set that just a quick fade out at the end, just to make sure that it sounds right at the end. I think a lot of people skip over that. Okay, so with our cycle region on, you want to be sure to turn that on. Now, before we bounce this out, you want to turn off any sort of limiting that you put on. At the end of the last video, we talked about using a limiter to bring it up to a more commercial volume as we're doing our mix revisions. We want to go ahead and turn that off because that's a step that we're going to do in the mastering process. So turn off any sort of limiting that you have. I'm also going to turn off my level meter. I'm sure there's no actual sound impact from this plugin, but I just turn off anything that doesn't need to be on. It's kind of a paranoia thing. I don't know. Anyway, and then you just want to hit bounce on your master track here. You can see this in this window by hitting I, or you can go over to the mixer window and hit this little B and C in the bottom right corner there. And then we just want to make sure that we're bouncing out a PCM, that you have wave selected, 24-bit, and then whatever the sample rate of your session is fine. And then I like to turn off dithering for this. We'll turn it on when we're exporting out our final master. Dithering's complicated, it doesn't really matter. All that you need to know is that you don't need it on in this phase, but you do want to have it on for your final master. So we'll turn it off here, and then we'll have offline bounce. And because I set my cycle region, you'll see this is roughly the time of my song. If you don't set your cycle region, or if you have selected a region of audio, then it's just going to do that, or it's going to do the entire length of the session pretty much. So be sure to set your cycle region, and you should see the appropriate amount of time for just your song. We'll go ahead and hit OK. And pay attention to where you bounce this out, because we're going to need to go find it in just a second. Once it's finished bouncing out, we're just going to create a new session. We'll close this session. And then in this session, we just want to create an audio track. And then we need to go to our Finder and find where we just saved that bounced version of our song. So be sure that you're clear about how you're titling your track so it's easy for you to find it, whatever makes sense to you. And we just want to bring this into the new mastering session. But right off the bat, we also want to go ahead and take it and hold Option on the keyboard and drag this down to create a duplicate of this. And what I like to do is call this top one unmastered, and we'll mute it, and we'll call this one mastered. And that way, anytime throughout the mastering process, I could quickly solo the unmastered one, just to quickly tell if I'm making progress in my mastering, if I'm liking what I'm doing, and not just that I'm changing it, as I said before. Okay, so the second thing is to bring your song into the session. The third thing we need to do is bring a reference track into the session. So a reference track is just something that we can quickly reference to make sure that we're gonna stand up against commercial releases and or other releases that are out. So in this case, I'm gonna bring in the last single from my band so that I know that it's going to hold up against recent releases for us. I will also typically bring in 1, 2, 3 other professional masters to compare it against. I'm not going to do it in this video just because of copyright strikes and things like that, but you want to have if other releases that you've done so you know it will stand up against your other releases, and then other professional mixes that you can quickly reference against. And then we just want to mute that track as well. So this is going to be one of our references. This is our master track that we're going to be focusing on. And then if you have other references, you'll just put them down below this and mute all of them. That way, if you don't have anything muted, you're hearing your master track, and then you can jump into one of these soloed tracks to either hear your song unmastered or one of the reference tracks. Okay, so with nothing else soloed, the next thing we want to do is go on ahead and run the mastering assistant. Now, we're not mastering a song with the mastering assistant. I'm going to teach you a process for getting a better master, in my opinion, than the mastering assistant will typically give you. But it's kind of just like having a second mastering engineer master the song, and then you can compare yours up against this AI mastered version and just see what you like better, and if there's anything you like from theirs better that you want to try to do in your master. It's free, so why not do it, right? But we're going to go ahead and turn that off. And then the last thing we're going to do in this setup is under metering, we're going to pull up the multimeter. And this is just a great way to know everything that's going on inside your master. I've done an entire video where I talk about this plugin, I'll link to above here. But this is going to be the meter that we're going to keep an eye on, especially when it comes to making our song loud, so that we know how loud we're getting with our mix. But also as we're comparing the frequency response of our mix against our other reference tracks, this meter is going to allow us to do that. So I can now just have this meter up. I can listen to my master once I get into it, and then I could quickly solo this other master and compare tonally what I'm hearing, volume-wise what I'm hearing, just to make sure, again, that they're going to stand up against each other in a final released version. So that's how you set up a mastering session. Now, in a second, I'm going to show you, if you are ever working on an EP or album, how to lay that out in your session. So stick around if that's interesting to you. If not, then this video is done for you. But it's important that you set this up. You actually take the time to do this, because it's going to do two things. One, it's going to shift you out of mixing mode. It's going to make you focus into mastering mode, which means that you're going to make sure that you get your mix done before you bring it in here, because it's a real pain to keep going back and forth between the two. And two, it's going to mean that you're really focusing in just on what you're doing in mastering, and you're not kind of jumping back and forth between mastering kind of and fixing it in the mix and just letting that be nebulous. If you treat it the way that professionals do, which is that you have a dedicated mixing engineer, a dedicated mastering engineer, you're likely going to get a better final result. But anyway, let's jump over to an EP mastering session so you can see how I lay that all out. Okay, so here we have an EP mastering session, and this is a little bit different because two of these songs were mastered and released as singles first. So the way I've set this up, I have this song that was already mastered, so I brought in the mastered version of that, and then I brought in the first unmastered song, and I set up my mastered track and then my unmastered track. And then this song was mastered, so I just brought in the final mastered version of that. And then I brought in the next song that was unmastered, and I have a mastered version and unmastered version. And then finally, the last song, it's an EP, so it's just 5 songs. We have the mastered and unmastered versions. And then throughout, I have reference tracks that correlate to the different songs. So I could quickly go between this song, this master here, and check against this other release. And those are pretty different songs, but you can get a sense just that if those were back-to-back in a playlist, they're not going to be like, oh god, that sounds way off compared to that other song, right? So that's the idea here, is basically that you can lay them out as if you were just going through all the songs. So you could listen through this from start to finish, and I can check, like, how does this transition from the end of this song? How does it naturally transition into the next song here as we get into it? Does that sound right volume-wise? Does that sound right tonally, right? Same thing as I get to the end of this song here. Right? I can make sure there's the right amount of space. So one thing I'm also checking is how long do I want it to be before that next song starts, so I can feel for that. And then the way I set my cycle region is just basically making sure that I have the right amount of length. So I sometimes will go a little bit past where the song actually ends so that it goes into the next song at the right moment for me. So you can get really intentional with it, and then you're listening to the tone across all the tracks, and then I have the mastering for each individual track on these individual tracks, and then I have on my stereo output the 1 meter that I can listen or pay attention to all the mixes and all the masters through, make sure that they're all looking and sounding right and are hitting roughly the same LUFS and all the different volume scores that you want to be paying attention to, and that the EQ analyzer is looking roughly appropriate across all of them. There's nothing really glaringly different. I can look at all that information very quickly with just this 1 meter that's set on my stereo output here. So that's the way I set up an EP mastering track. It would be the same for an album, just obviously with more songs. And you can see that it's just more helpful than just doing this in each individual session. And at the end of the day, it's actually going to be much faster doing this in one session as opposed to going into each individual session of a mix and trying to just do your master there, export it out, check it against all the other songs. This, in the end of the day, is actually going to save me a lot of time. And it's going to get me a better result, at least in my opinion, in my experience. Okay, and now it's finally time to master our song. People on YouTube make mastering seem way too complicated. The reality is there's only 3 things we're doing in the mastering process: shaping our tone, shaping our dynamics, and then bringing our loudness up to commercial standards. Now, that's a simple process, but that doesn't mean it's always easy. So in today's video, I'm going to show you an easy process that you can follow to get professional sounding results inside Logic with only the stock plugins. Let's go and jump into Logic. So as I mentioned, there's 3 things that we're doing. We're fine-tuning our tone, we're fine-tuning the dynamics, and we're trying to bring it up to commercial loudness so that it's going to sound as loud as everything else on the radio within reason, as long as it's not making it sound worse. So the first thing you want to do before you do any processing on your track is just listen to your song against your references to determine, is there anything that it needs. Now, a couple of tricks when it comes to using references is that they're going to be louder, so you should expect to turn them down. In most cases, if you follow my mixing process, you're going to be turning the mastered versions of songs that you're using as references down by about 7 decibels. So I'm going to go ahead and grab both of these references and just bring them down about 7 decibels. Second trick is that you want to line up key sections of your song. So in this case, I'm just going to line up the second verse, but sometimes I might do more than that, where I'll chop the chorus and put it right where one of my choruses is. But the way that I'm going to do it here is I'm just going to find the verse of this song here, second verse. So right around here, and I'm just going to put this roughly around the start of my second verse here. So now I'll hear that verse right up against my verse. And now they're also roughly the same volume. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring this back so that I have the full song before as well, in case I just want to go to this section here. But I just want to line up those key sections. I'm going to do the same thing here with this second song. So now I can listen to this verse and then listen to my verse in my song. Okay, so a couple different references here. They're both from recent releases, and they're going to give me a good picture of what I need to be listening for tonally and in terms of dynamics. So let's listen to the mix that we're going to be mastering and then flip over to these and focus in on the EQ, the tone that you're hearing. Does it need more brightness? Does it need more low end? Is there anything going on in the mid-range that isn't working compared to these references? So we'll start with our mix here.
Pushing it away. You say it's just to get out. Can't you ever see? Now you're saying you're proud.
And then something out of nothing, now it's something enough.
I'm getting sick of it, yeah.
I've been down, but I've never been down yet.
Tell me your soul and I'm on your team.
Okay, so I think we need a little bit more brightness, a little bit more energy up there, and then a little less, there's kind of a muddiness going on down in the low end. So we're going to start with a linear phase EQ. If you go under EQ, find your linear phase EQ. This is going to introduce the least amount of issues. EQ can add a little bit of phasing. Linear phase shouldn't add any. So this is my go-to EQ for kind of addressing problems. As I mentioned, there's a little bit of muddiness I kind of want to address with this. Very, very small moves. And then I might bring in a little bit of presence with this, but we'll just see. Typically, I don't do too much additive EQ with this, but sometimes I'll do a little bit. Okay, so let's see if we can find where this muddiness is left. So I think somewhere around there, if I exaggerate it up, I'm cutting right now about 1.5 decibels if I exaggerate it up. There's just kind of this weird, it's not quite boxy, but there's something kind of just muddy about it. That's probably the best word for it. So we're just going to cut that about 1.5 decibels here. You want to do really, really small moves in mastering. You don't want to be doing big moves or it's going to throw things off. So really, really small. If you need a bigger move, you know, sometimes you can break the rules in mastering, but a lot of times that tells me, oh, I might need to go back to the mix to fix this somewhere in the mix. Okay, so let's see if we want to add a little bit of presence on this EQ as well. Okay, now I can't quickly bypass this off and on because the way linear phase EQ works, it's going to have a little bit of a delay. So what I like to do is now check against my unmastered song here by soloing that and seeing, do I like the sound of these moves? They're going to be really, really subtle, but we're training our ears to make these subtle moves, right? Okay. Really focus down in on that low end, kind of low mid-range area. It's feeling a little bit muddy down there. And then up in the presence, and you'll notice when I go back to my mastered version, it just feels a little bit cleaner. Let's go to maybe this verse into this verse. I'm definitely liking that better. Okay, so first move, feeling pretty good. Now, I know I want a little bit more presence, so instead of doing more on this linear phase EQ, what I'm going to do is go under my vintage EQ selection and pull up the tube EQ. I love this if I'm doing any sort of high fidelity, low end, high end boosts. And it adds a little bit of saturation, which is another tonal element. Actually, what I want to show you first is just listen to this off and on and notice, pay attention to kind of the low mids. In that same area, you're going to feel a little bit more warmth pop on, but it's not going to feel muddy in the same way. So we're going to get a little bit of warmth out of this just by putting this on. So this is on. Subtle, but it's just a little bit that pops on in that mid-range area. But what I really want to use this for is the high boost and maybe a little bit of the low boost. With a high boost, I typically have my high bandwidth here, which is kind of like how wide of a curve it is. I typically have this either about halfway or higher for mastering, so really gentle. And then we just boost kind of excessively and find the frequency that's giving us the kind of presence that we want that's working on this song. It varies a little bit song to song. So let's go ahead and go back to here.
Out of the thick of it. Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. All getting sick of it, yeah.
So as I start to get close to 10, I start to notice that it feels like a little bit papery, and I don't want to do too much of that. So I'm going to keep it up here around 12K, which is going to be super airy frequencies. And then we're just going to dial this all the way back and dial it up until we first start to notice it. So somewhere in there, I'm starting to notice it a little bit. Let's go and turn this off and on. Subtle, but it's starting to help this mix feel just a little bit more lively. Okay, and then let's do the same thing in the low end with just a little bit of a boost. Now I'm going to do the Pultec trick, which is where you boost and cut. So this curve right here is a low boost and this is a low cut. And I can do it at the same low frequency that I set here, but their curves are slightly different. So it ends up kind of dipping out a little bit of the muddiness in the low end and giving you just a little bit more low end. So I think I want to try that at least on this and make sure I like the sound of it better. Let's go back to that verse again.
Pushing it away. You say it's just to get out. Yeah, it's just to get out. Out of the thick of it. Now you're saying you're proud. Yeah, you're saying you're proud. All getting sick of it, yeah.
Somewhere around here feels good to me, so I'll bring it back down and mix it up.
All getting sick sick of it, yeah.
Add in a little bit of volume, so I'm just going to turn the volume down here just a little bit. Cool. Okay, let's go back and listen to our unmastered track again.
Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud. We're all getting sick of it, yeah.
It's feeling a little bit clearer and a little bit fuller at the same time. I really like that. And then let's compare it to our masters.
I'll never leave you.
Reference track.
Or the eyes of someone else. No,
I'd settle down.
and I'm running.
And I'll never leave you.
Cool. I'm feeling pretty good about that. Now, I'm a little bit darker than this track and maybe a little bit brighter than this track, so that's probably a good sweet spot. I think this song should feel a little bit more dynamic, a little bit brighter, a little bit livelier, but not necessarily as overhyped. This Big Dream song, we really wanted this like kind of crazy effect on it. Now, real quick, if you're enjoying this video and you're finding it helpful and you think it'd be helpful to someone else, could you be sure to like it? It makes a big difference in terms of YouTube showing it to other people. And if you're not enjoying this video, could you be sure to hit the dislike button twice? And also, while you're still watching this video, go watch something else. Anyway, okay, so these are our two EQs. Now we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of dynamic shaping, and we're going to do that just with the stock Logic compressor, but I'm going to do it in dual mono mode. And what that allows us to do is have slightly, it's going to react to the left and right ear slightly differently. I really like that for my compression on a master because it isn't just all moving together, and I find I just like the sound of it a little bit better. Okay, so first thing I do is I hit couple here so that any changes I make on this left side, right now there's left and right sides, any changes I make on this left side are going to carry over to the right side. I don't need to adjust them independently. We're going to turn auto gain off here. I'm going to leave this auto release on, and we could play around with these. I know from my experience, I typically end up using this vintage VCA if I'm doing any sort of mastering compression with the stock Logic compressor, but it doesn't hurt to play around with them. Okay, typically I'll go with a slow attack somewhere around 30 to 50 milliseconds on my attack time. Auto release, or I'll be somewhere in the 50 to 100 milliseconds, sometimes even slower, but I typically find that somewhere in that with most rock music works pretty well for me. And then we'll keep this ratio here about 2 to 1. I think that's typically pretty good in a mastering scenario. Okay, let's go and play with it here. Honestly, right off the bat, that's feeling pretty good to me. You want to be careful. If you go too fast on your attack, you're going to notice the drums are going to start getting really squashed. You know, obviously that was getting a lot of compression in general, but as you slow it down, you're going to start feeling the hits move through more appropriately, and you're really just looking to 1 to 2, maybe 3 decibels maximum of gain reduction on this music. So that's starting to help it feel a little bit livelier, getting me closer to those reference tracks and feeling like it's just adding good energy from the unmastered version. And the last thing I want to do here is try this distortion, really soft distortion. This is, again, really saturation, really subtle saturation is going to help warm up our mix, fill it out, give it a more hyped feel, while not necessarily overdoing it. Typically, you don't really notice it, but it emulates what's going on with analog gear in the physical world, just inside Logic. Now, anytime I do this, I notice I have to dial my output gain down by about 2 decibels, so I'm not adding volume. Let's see what we think of this. Yeah, I think I like it. So yeah, it's tricky. I wish that they would link these so that I could just quickly turn that up and it would turn the volume down equally so that I can hear if I like the sound of it. But let's go ahead and listen now back to our unmastered version. Notice how everything just feels like it's right up here with us now. It's like right up there, even though we haven't brought up the volume at all. There might be a little bit of volume gain just naturally through this processing. So let's actually turn our mastered version down just a little bit. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to hold Option on the keyboard and click that back so it goes back up to 0. And then let's pull up our multimeter and let's get a general sense of where the LUFS on our 2 reference tracks are sitting compared to this song. We're going to look just at the momentary, which is this S here.
Out of the figure. Now you're saying you're proud. Yeah, you're saying you're proud. We're all getting sicker.
Okay, so around -13, -14, so technically up to Spotify standards, but I'm telling you, no professional mastering engineer that I know is actually masters to -14. They're always mastering more around -8 for most rock genres. I've done a whole video on loudness levels. I'll link to it above here. If you are confused by Spotify loudness levels and just loudness levels in general, definitely check that out. Okay, let's go ahead and then compare to our 2 reference tracks here. I'm going to turn the audio of the songs in this section down so it's not way louder for you, but just know that these are louder.
Tell me your soul and I'm on your team. Never get sold, it's a big, big dream.
Okay, so this song, we're really pushing it. We're about 6.5 there. How about this song here? So closer to -8 on this one. And then we're around -13.5 on the song that we're working on now. So we're probably going to end up adding something like 5 to 6 decibels. This song doesn't need to be as hyped as that first song. That song, again, we're kind of going for the crazy sound. This last song is probably closer to the range that I'm looking for, but I'm probably going to end up closer to -8. On my LUFS score. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring up under Dynamics a limiter. Now, a trick for getting really, really good limiting is using 2 limiters. On the first one, I do the remove DC offset, but I leave true peak detection off. And then on the second one, I'll put true peak detection on and turn the remove DC offset off. I don't think I need any redundant amount of either of those things. We'll bring the ceiling down to just -0.3 to make sure that it never spikes too far. And let's look at what this is already doing. All we're looking for in this first limiter is just a little bit of gain reduction on the loudest peak. So let's check that Okay, so I feel pretty good about that. About 1.5 decibels of gain reduction, really just on the loudest peaks of the snare. That means that this limiter is working very, very subtly. We're probably not going to notice it too much. And then we're going to introduce a second limiter here. And what I like to do with this second adaptive limiter is set it to dual mono. So again, it's going to be racked into the left and the right ears differently. I'm going to set it to couple here. And then we're going to turn remove DC offset off and then turn true peak detection on. True peak detection just means that there's not going to be any inner sample peaks. It's complicated. I can't explain it in this video, but just know that you want to have that on for your final master. And then we're going to bring this output ceiling down to -0.3. This is just to protect ourselves, make sure that if it ever somehow peaks past this limiter, that it's not going to be too loud and actually clip. And then let's go ahead and bring this gain all the way down and bring it up. Paying attention to the gain reduction meter and listening with our ears to make sure we're not getting any sort of pumping or distortion that we don't like. That's sounding pretty good to me. Let's now go ahead and pull up our meter. I try to not have my meter up as I'm working and then check it in between, because otherwise I feel like I'm looking for a number and I'll start to focus on that more than listen with my ears. So just a little tip for you there. Let's keep going in kind of this latter section of the song here. Now, I don't necessarily think it's over compressed, but I think I could maybe do with a little bit less. So we're going to bring it back down somewhere around here and listen to that. Looking a little bit better, feeling a little bit better. Let's go back to this master.
Tell me your soul and I'm on your team.
The one thing I'm noticing now as I'm going through these and they're all level matched and the same amount of limiting roughly, is I feel like I just have a little bit too much low end. So I'm going to dial this boost back just a little bit on this Pultec to just clean it up a little bit. Cool. Okay, I'm feeling really good about that. Now, the last thing that I always do after I've done this limiting is now I bring this mastered version down about 7 decibels and I compare it to my unmastered version. And I just want to see which one do I think sounds better, right? And I am going to bring up the video volume in this section, so it should sound about the same volume as we were just hearing it, but that's just in post-production, just so your ears aren't getting knocked around. So to me, I don't notice that I'm losing anything from this master, and that's the first thing. And then I think in general, I think the clarity and the tone that's come through is just a little bit better. In mastering, you're inherently going to be squashing your mix a little bit. That's part of bringing it up to commercial volume. And so as long as I'm not losing anything, I'm generally happy with it. And if I can add just a little bit of clarity, add a little bit of improvement, then I feel like I'm really winning. Now, the very last thing that I want to do is compare my master that we just did here to Apple's AI master. So I'm going to turn everything off here, and we're going to pull up the mastering that Logic can do for us. We ran that back when we set up this mastering session, and now I want to listen to this compared to mine and determine if I like either better. So this is their master. This is Logic's AI mastering assistant master. Let's go back to this verse area here.
Instead of pushing it away, you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the figure.
I'm going to bypass theirs and turn all of mine back on again.
Now you're saying you're proud, yeah, you're saying you're proud.
Turn mine off, turn theirs back on.
All getting sick of it, yeah.
Oddly, I kind of noticed theirs pumping maybe. Let's turn all mine back on. And one more time back to theirs. So theirs sounds quieter to me. Sounds like it somehow is pumping a little bit. And it sounds duller and kind of weird. Honestly, I'm kind of shocked at how much I don't like their master. I usually find something in their master. I'm like, oh, that's helpful. But no matter what, you should always do this because it's going to give you more confidence in your master, or it's going to help you, give you something that you can learn from their master. If their master is sounding better than yours, what can you take from it to apply to yours to give you a better final master? Okay, so that's the mastering process. The very last thing I want to do in this video, if you've been following along with me, is go through and compare it back to my 6-step mix. So if you haven't seen the 6-step mixing process, I'll link to it above here. We've gone through this entire process together and now mastering. In the 6-step mixing process, we're just going through the 6 steps that all professional mixers have inside Logic, and we did it in real time. And there's a guide that you can download so that you can use it next time you're mixing. I've actually brought in my static mix from that, and I want to compare our static mix to the final mix, and then now to the final master, roughly volume balanced here. I think it was somewhere around 5.2 that I was turning that down. Static mix is just our volumes and pan position set, and then we mix it, and then the master. Okay, static mix first. Let's go back to this verse here.
Instead of giving out the names,
Gosh.
instead of lying that you stay, instead of pushing it away, you say it's just to get out, yeah, it's just to get out of the figure.
Back to static mix. So it's basically unmixed versus mixed. And it's us in against master. And if we go then just unmixed against mixed and mastered, it's going to be wild, right? So this is the static mix here. So more or less unmixed compared to mixed and mastered.
Instead of pushing it away, instead of pushing it away, you say it's just to get out of the figure. Now you say
I'm really happy with that. Okay, one absolute final thing is exporting this bad boy out. Now that we've finished it, we want to select the song, hit Command U on the keyboard, and we want to go down to bounce here. And then I always do an MP3 as I'm bouncing it out. We want to select 24-bit wave. We want to turn dithering to power 1 dithering. And that's it. You can export it out. You can use the MP3 just to send it quickly to your friends or to yourself. You can use a wave to upload to all the streaming platforms. And you can be confident that you just created the best master because you've compared it back to the AI mastering in Logic and you already know it beat that. Or you went with the Logic AI mastering and that's totally fine as well. Before you go, if you don't already have my 6-step checklist to a pro mix, it's really going to help you out. As you just heard, it is a wild transformation going from the unmixed version to the mixed version and now to the mastered version. That 6-step checklist goes through the entire mixing process that we use to mix this exact song. So be sure to pick it up for free from the link in the description below. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Have you been following a mastering process somewhat like this? Let me know in the comments below. If this video was helpful, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.
one thing at a time.